Okay, Duvid here. We are live with another week, my weekly tour of my library, book recommendations with on tour of my week 5 already. I'm going to check this. So a few people who follow my regular content and asked me to do this topic, God forbid. And actually, one of the first, when I first did a tour of my library, this was one of the books that I showed quite a bit. God forbid, it's a very important topic, kind of a dark topic, considering, God forbid, rising anti-Semitism and various things. It's a timely, important topic. God forbid, I was on Adam Green yesterday talking about anti-Semitism, various things. So, hopefully a timely topic. It's a subject that I've read a lot of books on. I never formally studied like in university. I'd studied in yeshiva. It's not necessarily a topic that is formally studied in the sense of academic or historically. But I went to schools largely founded by Holocaust survivors, the Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem. That Mir was a town in Poland that was destroyed during the war and was resettled in Japan and then China and then New York and Israel. And God forbid, I went to Jewish schools, Bobov, Karlin Stolen, all of these school places that were largely destroyed World War II in Europe. So just show here real quick. This is week 5 that I've been doing this. And the first one that I did quite a while ago when I showed my library, and there I actually spent about 10 minutes just going over some of these books. So a lot of these books I showed then on my very first stream, so people could check that out. And then also my Ask the Rabbi, God forbid, Ask the Rabbi number 3 I did on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and I showed a lot of slides. It went on for almost 3 hours, and I covered quite a bit of information and have slideshows. So it's a big topic, and then I also did an Ask the Rabbi on Jewish anti-Zionism and the transfer agreement. So that's the next one on the playlist. And actually, I had Otto Pohl join me for that one. I think he's still around. Otto Pohl is actually a history professor. So I'm going to figure out how I'm going to do this. Okay, so I have a lot of books to show, so I'm going to get right to it. I probably have like 80 books. I've probably read hundreds of books. So just to lay it out, I'm going to show. It's hard to make an order and book recommendation. Like if you wanted to learn more about, God forbid, the Holocaust. I wouldn't say there's really any really good books on it, or even informative. That you have to read a lot of books on it. So there's really no good place to start. You just any book start with, and it's really a huge topic, like World War II, everything that happened World War II, geographically, huge areas, Jewish history in Europe going into World War II, versus the lead up to World War II, from the military perspective, the political perspective, the economic perspective, from the various sides, to God forbid, the Holocaust itself, what happened to the Jews. And so let me just God forbid, jump right in. So I think I actually. So I have a whole bunch of what I'll call Jewish books, books that are written by Jews for Jews. And those are a different nature than the academic book. And, to say they're written by historians, that you people have studied the full gamut of history. So a lot of the books that are Jewish books written by Jews for Jews, um, are somewhat we call ahistorical. They're not historical academics that don't know the full gamut of European or World War II history and focus just on the Holocaust itself, or from the Jewish perspective, what happened to us, and without a wider historic application of what was going on at the time. And so, like Jewish biography, God forbid, almost all the rabbis, I probably have 100 books, biographies, like the Lubavitch Rebbe, all the famous rabbis that came from Europe to America that will cover their experience in the war. But I said those are somewhat we call ahistorical because the authors of the book haven't really studied from a military historical perspective what happened. Henry Abramson, for example, I have his book that he wrote on the Piaseczny and Rebbe, with the history of like the Eish Kodesh and what he was writing in the Warsaw Ghetto from the military perspective of what was happening at the same time. So I'm not going to go over a lot of my Jewish books. They say one of these future streams, I'm going to do a whole tour of my Judaic library, and say I have 4 full shelves on it. Those 4 shelves behind me, and I will quickly show these 3 books. Kenneth Powers, thanks for tuning in. How do I find the time? Like I read a few hours a day. So honestly, since COVID-19 hit, I haven't really read anything on the Holocaust. I'm going to show you like piles of books that have been stacking up. I used to read regularly, or God forbid, during like Tisha B'av, the 3 weeks, or certain times of the year, I would read more about the Holocaust, or I have a few books on my desk because God forbid, it's an important subject, and I'm always reading. So if I have tens of books that I'm in the middle of, that I usually had 1 or 2 on World War II, and before COVID-19. There would be Jewish events, and I would be buying new books. New books would be coming out. I'll show you some of these books I even have autographed. That like the Jewish Book Fair, local synagogues, Judaic studies programs, where authors would come to town, and I would buy their books. So since COVID-19, it changed perspective. Like obviously, World War II and the Holocaust is an extremely important subject, but changed my perspective on what's more important, and I turned back to more reading about science. So I'll show these books. Here is The World That Was. And these are designed as kind of for teachers in Jewish schools. It was actually from the Hebrew Academy of Cleveland. And it's just trying to show what Jewish life was like in Europe before the war. And I have some more books. So this divided Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, and Poland. So to have a full understanding of God forbid what Jewish life was like before the war, that there were hundreds of Jewish towns, thousands of Jewish towns, even like I showed in my Jewish music overview, that all the towns, the Hasidic towns, like Belz, Bobov, Sanz, Satmar, Lubavitch, Karlin, Stolin, so my names are slipping me around, like Loitsk. I really should be able to name hundreds of them. Most rabbis and rebbes are named after the towns that we came from in Europe, like Bialystok and And unfortunately, God forbid, most of those towns were destroyed. A lot of those towns were uh, like Rebbe Nachman and Uman and Breslov, all towns that were, to some extent, some of them were 20% Jewish, some of them were over 50% Jewish. So there weren't really any 100% Jewish towns. They were all mixed towns, but some of them had more than 50% Jews. Some of them had tens of thousands of Jews, like Satmar, Lubavitch, Belz, had tens of thousands of Jews living in them, and some of them had a few thousand Jews. There were yeshiva towns like Kelm, Kamenetz, Mir. The names of the major yeshivas today were towns that go back hundreds of years, where there were sizable Jewish populations. It goes back to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that created a special environment that made it friendly for Jews to come in. So let me put these back on my shelf. So, God forbid, there were expulsions of Jews across Europe, mostly in Western Europe, like France, England, Germany, Spain, going into 1492 and the Inquisition, or the period leading into the Inquisition, where the majority of Jews were closer to the Atlantic in Western Europe, and after God forbid, a series of calamities, bad things, expulsions, pogroms, the Crusades, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire makes a strategic move and allows the Jews to enter Eastern Europe and set up. They had some sort of feudal system, mannerism, like Ukraine and Poland, and local nobility that where land ownership was under the royalty, and then they had local lords, and Jews had a certain right of property or to live there under somewhat self-government, and that allowed thousands, probably literally thousands of small Jewish settlements to sprout up across Eastern Europe, and God forbid, during the war, almost all of those were destroyed. So, it's pretty complicated. So I'm not going to give a lecture on the Holocaust. It's a big topic. I'm just going to go over, some of my books. So here's a few books on banking and finance. These are popular books. And anyone who's read a lot of books on the Holocaust probably is familiar with these. James Poole, Who Financed Hitler? The Secret Funding of Hitler's Rise to Power, 1919 to 1933, and Hitler and His Secret Partners, Contributions, Loot, and Rewards, 1933 to 1945, that cover the financial backing, who was excited, God forbid, about the rise to power of the Nazis, who were his financial backers going into the war and through the war. So, important, topic. How did the Nazis rise to power? Who backed them? Not besides the actual people who were part of the Nazi power party, but the bankers. Here's another monetary book on Deutsche Bank and the Nazi economic war against the Jews. So Deutsche Bank, God forbid, David is a Bamberger. Deutsche Bank was partially founded by a distant relative of mine, Ludwig Bamberger, but Deutsche Bank was the German bank, and it confiscated the assets of the Jews during World War II. And so this book covers kind of how Deutsche Bank operated, how the expropriation of Jewish businesses and property during the war, by Harold James, Princeton University. So it's really a huge topic, World War II. So I'm putting try to put it a little into topical areas together. And, it's hard because, there's books that are all over the place, and it's, big topic. So just here, was an interest of mine for a while. The Jehovah's Witness. I went to my local Jehovah's Witness temple or meeting house. My local Jehovah's Witness before COVID-19 used to come, regularly to doors, and I used to speak with him. And people, Jehovah's Witness were persecuted during the war and killed. And people who know about the camps know about the purple triangle that Jehovah's Witness wore. And it's estimated that about 5,000 Jehovah's Witnesses were killed during the war. And it's pretty interesting. So here's Between Resistance and Martyrdom, Jehovah's Witness in the Third Reich, that has this is a huge book. It's translated from German, Garbe. So I'm not, certainly familiar. So this is translated from the German, and it has a history of Jehovah's Witness, the rise of the Third Reich, the conflict, the original persecution. Actually, Jehovah's Witnesses were one of the first groups to be persecuted. Tinkle, Shalom, thanks for showing up. And some of the first concentration camps, even God forbid, before Jews were sent to concentration camps, they were used for Jehovah's Witnesses. And concentration camps were death camps, where originally they were like re-education centers, where they were hoping through separating them from society or even torture and violence, that they would be able to get them to renounce their ways. And so this is like the magnum opus. It's translated from German, Between Resistance and Martyrdom, Jehovah's Witness in the Third Reich. Here, Renaud and Graf. This is another book translated into English from German, Jehovah's Witness and the Nazis, Persecution, Deportation, and Murder, 1933 to 1945. God forbid. Just an interesting topic on the persecution of the Jehovah's Witness. And here, I think this is also translated from German, Persecution and Resistance of Jehovah's Witness during the Nazi regime, 1933 to 1955. And I think this has all the various camps that Jehovah's Witnesses were in. And of interest, Jehovah's Witness in the camps, a lot of them were killed. There was a sheet of paper that they could have signed and renounced at any time, at least the Aryan Jehovah's Witness, that they could have voluntarily renounced their religion and they would have been released. But only a handful of them did. And there were some Jehovah's Witness that survived. Even my local Jehovah's Witness meeting house, like in Oakland County, there's still some, so to say, Holocaust survivors of the Jehovah's Witness that went through the camps. And the local meeting house in Southfield here, Michigan, has the purple triangle. God forbid, from people that survived the camps. So it's interesting topic. I said the World War II and the Holocaust is a huge topic. So this is a famous book, the Buchenwald Report, translated from German also, that covers what was seen in Buchenwald when the camp was liberated, and goes over the concentration camp statistics, deaths, the luxurious living of the SS, what daily life was like, work, punishment camp, sanitary and health, conditions, the liberation, some of the war crime trials, and various aspects. So people who know their World War II history, Holocaust history, this is, God forbid, one of the main literature books, and scary stuff about one of, not like Auschwitz, but one of the main concentration camps. I forget if there was also an extermination camp, but they certainly had experiments, medical experiments, and horrible things happening there. And the Buchenwald. So these are books that I've read. Although the Garbe, Between Resistance and Martyrdom, I didn't finish. This is an interesting book, God forbid. Stella, I think they made a movie about this. Peter Wyden, One Woman's True Tale of Evil, Betrayal, and Survivor in Hitler's Germany. It's, God forbid, about a Jewish woman with Aryan appearance that tried to escape being persecuted as a Jew by pretending not to be Jewish, and then eventually worked for the Germans to recruit and catch other Jews and in Berlin. And I think she was eventually caught and sent to prison as a Nazi collaborator. But God forbid, was a Jewish woman with Aryan features that collaborated with the Nazis. And I think Poison Ivy or something. Poison is like a name of a book or play they made about her. Here's an important topic, like related to the local PBS special about the Rescue Board in America's effort to save Jews during the war. So I think this one I have autographed. So I think this woman, Rebecca Erbelding, she was actually in the PBS special recently, and you see I have this autograph to David with best wishes, 11/9/18. So 4 years ago, she was at the Jewish Book Fair and spoke, and I went to her lecture. I got the book autographed, The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe, including the funding of Raoul Wallenberg and Morgenthau. And, so the PBS special with Ken Burns, takes a harsh view on it could be harsher, but the view on the Roosevelt administration and what they did to save Jews, what they possibly could have done to save more. But eventually the Roosevelt administration sets up a rescue board and does things like funding Raoul Wallenberg and various things that saved tens of thousands of Jews. This is Battling for Souls, the Vaditzola Rescue Committee in post-war Europe. So there wasn't necessarily enough action by the U.S. government. So the Vaditzola, that Eliezer Silver, Rabbi Silver, and then later Rav Aaron Cutler, and Rabbi of Mir Yeshiva, name slipping me right now, so I apologize. Headed, and the Rabbis March on Washington, and the internal majority Orthodox Jewish attempt to raise money and save Jews. Some questionable activity, God forbid, like trying to bribe Nazi officers, which the U.S. government was not in favor of, or illegal, trying to save people's lives by illegally transferring them to other countries. But the effort to raise money and then negotiate to try to save lives in Europe. So the Vaditzola is the Jewish Rescue Board by Alex Grubman, and this is published by a Jewish group. Here is Butler's The Illustrated History of the Gestapo. So this is the secret police, and so it's a pictorial history of the Gestapo, the founding of the Gestapo, and their activities through the war. And Heinrich Himmler, the brown shirts, even the use of Jewish people in the ghettos and camps. Here's Christopher John Bjorkness' book, Premonitions of the Holocaust. And I actually didn't know, Warning to the Jews, and I actually didn't know who he is when Adam Green had me on the first time, and he wanted me to speak to Bjorkness. I was like, oh, I have his book. And I guess he's he's a counter-Semite, but I didn't know that from even having his book and reading his book. Extremely well researched, and it talks about the warnings and the alarm of premonitions of the Holocaust. It has a collection of newspaper articles, mostly from the London Times, in the 1910s through 1920s, of warnings of bad things that are likely to happen to the Jews. It also has a section on the Armenian genocide, and also a collection of newspaper articles about the 6 million. So, the question where the 6 million number comes from, or what, God forbid, the exact number of Jews that died during the war. The 6 million number largely comes from before the war. And you could see in these newspaper articles going back to the before World War I, there were warnings that, God forbid, 6 million Jews might die in Eastern Europe. And then it was the fear in Russia. And, so Bjorknes collected together from the archives hundreds of newspaper clippings of warnings of the possible death of 6 million Jews in Eastern Europe. And at that point, it wasn't considered Germany as the threat. And, even the New York Times were carrying articles warning of possibly the destruction of 6 million Jews in Eastern Europe, mostly Russia, at the time of the pogroms in, before World War I. So, interesting book. Christopher M. Bjorknes has a lot of books. But, this one's exceptionally well researched. And it said it's mostly just clippings of the London Times, New York Times letters from the 1910s, 1920s, called Premonition of the Holocaust. Here, cartoons against the Holocaust. Raphael Medoff is a popular author, very big critic of Franklin Roosevelt, from the Wyman Center of Jewish Studies. And so this is a collection of comic books. So this one's actually signed. I bought this online from the internet, so it's not signed to me. I've never met Raphael Medoff, but I bought the book online, and whoever sold it online sold me an autographed copy, Jeff, on his birthday, from Raphael Medoff. But talking about the comic book industry and kind of their effort to rally up, call it propaganda or support against the Nazis. I have another book I'll show on that here. Michael Berenbaum, I think he was from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Maybe he was the former director. And this is from the collection at the Holocaust Memorial Museum that kind of has a type full history, abridged history of, God forbid, what happened in World War II, with mostly pictures and kind of overview what you might see if you went to a Holocaust museum. Okay. So these are actually all books that I've read. So these books here are books that I've read. It's pretty hard to order these because the Holocaust is really a huge subject, and you order these, and even to you recommend books if you care about the subject, then you really just have to read a lot of books on that. So if Tinkles, if you're asking about the lockdown or yeah, I'm not going to get into the politics of various people and how they feel. So just go through some books to help understand what happened, what we could know about it. God forbid, maybe afterwards. In about an hour, I'll try to talk some more about, or even do an AMA or put the link in if someone wants to talk. These are Jewish books. God forbid, this famous picture, this man was killed in his tallis and tefillin. You can see him standing next to the dead bodies. And shortly after this picture was taken, he was murdered. Kaddish is a Jewish book on your stories of what happened. This was actually probably one of the first books I remember. A Rabbi Dijon Karlin Stolen recommended this book. And so this is written for Hasidic Jews, those who never yielded, and it's the history and Hasidic rebel movement in the ghettos of German-occupied Poland. So this is about Hasidic rebels who tried to fight back against the Nazis. And I remember Rabbi Dijon and Karlin Stolen, very popular rabbi, recommended this book and spoke of the war, God forbid, in terms of words of inspiration and people who overcame, God forbid, horrible tragedy. Some of the people survived, and I guess Rabbi Dijon probably knew them, and some of the people that in the book tell stories of. But there's more, we'll say an ahistorical book. It's written by Hasidic Jews, just from the perspective of the people who lived through it and their side of understanding. This is a very famous book, Yafra Elak's Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. Like the Blues River Rebbe and a lot of famous stories, God forbid, miraculous stories or inspiration or horrible stories, God forbid, during the war of the Hasidic Jews, Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. Here, when I was in University of Michigan, but before I ever debated counter-Semites, this is one of the more scholarly books, The Destruction of European Jewry, Raoul Hilberg, that goes in depth and detail of the deportation and murder of the Jews, the Holocaust by bullets, the various deportations and the killing operations, and the concentration camps. So this is Hilberg did not rely on Jewish sources, relied almost exclusively on German documentation, and so it's one of the definitive books of the Holocaust. Raoul Hilberg, Destruction of European Jewry. It's a terse read, kind of just the facts. A lot of crazy stories going through various deportations and goes country. It's organized country by country, and so God forbid, difficult reading. So here, Yehuda Bauer is the head of Yad Vashem. I think he's still alive, Holocaust survivor, and head of Yad Vashem, and he's written a lot of books. And so here's Rethinking the Holocaust, which I guess is more the theory, like instrumentalism versus intentionalism, and you God forbid trying to explain it and compare with other tragedy, and from the Jewish perspective, the various theology perspectives of how it happened, why it happened, what we could learn about it. It's in Yehuda Bauer. I think he's still alive. One of the big names in Holocaust studies, the head of Yad Vashem. Here's another, God forbid, important book, Jews for Sale, Nazi-Jewish Negotiations, 1933 to 1945, where, God forbid, during the war, the main method to save Jews was by bribing Nazis. Went even from 1933 with the transfer agreement, and I'm going to get to that shortly. But the main method of attempting to save Jews was usually through bribing Nazis. And so Yehuda Bauer, the head of Yad Vashem, talks about some of these deals and the history of it and the philosophy of it. And, so a pretty important book, God forbid. And, think theologically, what would you do in the time? And I mentioned the Hatzalah, the Rescue Board of the United States, and that generally, possibly the only method. I mean, like Raphael Medov, you talk about maybe you could have bombed Auschwitz, but in reality, the only way to save Jews was to bribe Nazis, and like Katzner and most of the Jews that were saved, even saying Raoul Wallenberg, not necessarily bribe Nazis, but to some extent, most of the Jews who were saved were done through bribing Nazis, and there wasn't really any other way to get Jews out of Nazi-controlled territory other than to bribe corrupt Nazis, God forbid. Lenny Breimer's 51 documents Jewish collaboration with the Nazis, God forbid. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? There were some Jews who collaborated with the Nazis, and so here is documentation of going back to Jabotinsky and Herzl, and kind of a pro anti-Semitic view for the creation of Israel, that anti-Semitism would help convince Jews to get out of Europe, to actually during the war, through the war, the transfer agreement, some of the bribes, some Jews who, God forbid, didn't care about their brethren. And so, this is very difficult reading, and it's just a collection of 51 documents translated with a little bit of explanations that shows, God forbid, Israeli state Zionist collaboration with the Nazis. Lenny Bremer. Here, Edwin Black, The Untold Story of the Secret Pact Between the Third Reich and the Jewish Palestine, known as the Havora Agreement. And I have most of Edwin Black's books. This is the first one I got, but I have his other books autographed. I'll get to them hopefully in a minute. But this covers the transfer agreement with the early Zionists in order to get Jews from Germany into Israel and to be able to transfer some of their wealth. And it's almost 400 pages. And ironically, Edwin Black said he had written and had 2 volumes, volume 2 and 3, and that there were transfer agreements possibly with America and other countries, but he decided not to publish them, God forbid, because it probably made Zionists in Israel look bad, because show that unfortunately there were Jews that cooperated with the Nazis. So unfortunate part of the war, but want the full picture of what happened World War II. It includes Jewish collaboration with the Nazis, including Israel, and the transfer agreement is pretty good book. Edwin Black. IC3, good to see you. Thanks for tuning in. So, God forbid, this is very tough reading. These are interviews. We wept without tears. Testimonies of the Jewish Soldier Commando from Auschwitz. So, understanding exactly what happened in World War II, the gas chambers, how people were killed, who did it, how Jews were used. So they had the unit, it was called Soldier Commando. So they're German Soldier Commandos, and then there were the Jewish Soldier Commandos that were chosen and to God forbid, convince the Jews as they arrived in Auschwitz to get into the gas chamber, to undress, and then afterwards, after they'd been killed, God forbid, to take their bodies and burn them, and take some of the property, the fillings, and various things, and they were usually killed every 3 months, God forbid, so there wouldn't be any testimony. That's why the people who actually witnessed the gas chambers, if the people who God forbid died, but the people who operated them, God forbid, were chosen from the prisoners and were generally killed every few months. There was also the attempt of the rebellion of the Soldier Commandos in various parts of the history. So only a handful of these, God forbid, fortunate people survived the war. I think tens of them. There's a few documentation. There's a few hidden records of people who wrote about their experience and then died. And then there's a handful of Soldier Commando that survived the war, and God forbid, how they got involved in it, when they were chosen, what they did, and the horrors of it. So very dark book, hard to read. So these are people living in Israel, people that worked as Soldier Commando and survived the war, and they were interviewed by Gideon Grief, And so God forbid dark reading, but important reading if you want to understand uh, how did it work, how did it happen, how did all these people get killed, how do they convince people to get into the gas chamber, how do they burn the bodies, um, God forbid, very few people who actually eyewitnessed that. And so here's the interview with just a handful of people that survived the war to tell the tale. So here is the Brian Mark Rigg books that actually, Veronica Kuzniar, and I'll mention her in a minute. I'll get to her books. Mentioned to me, and he actually spoke with Lowell Gallen. So I'm not working together with Lowell Gallen anymore, but it'd be interesting to interview Mark Rigg. I have his books. He wrote another book recently on I think ADD, attention deficit disorder. But so he wrote the lives of Hitler's Jewish soldiers, the untold story of Nazi racial laws and the men of Jewish descent in the German military, and rescued by the Reich, how one of Hitler's soldiers saved the Lubavitch Rebbe. So, this is an interesting book just dealing with the saving of the Lubavitch Rebbe in some details. And he, God forbid, Brigg doesn't necessarily take that favorable opinion towards the role of Lubavitch during the war, but he does give the story of the Nazi soldier that was used, that was half Jewish and possibly was bribed or influenced and ended up saving the Lubavitch Rebbe. And these books talk about Jews, some of them 100% Jewish, some of them part Jewish, that served as Nazis during the war. So, God forbid, it would appear that there's close to 200,000, up to quarter Jews that were Nazis, served in the Nazi army. There was the Hitler's Aryanization. There were a lot of Jews that were declared Aryan, even though they were Jewish, up to possibly 3,000 that Hitler signed off on, that Jews could be made, like, God forbid, honorary Aryans, that could have been signed off by Hitler, and various reasons, and the half Jews and the quarter Jews. So it's an important part of the war history. If you think your rising anti-Semitism, who's a Jew, and the various questions that there were a lot of assimilated Jews, there were a lot of Jews who abandoned their Judaism and served as Nazis, and not just like a handful, but tens of thousands, possibly as many as 200,000. So definitely important reading. Brian Mark Rigg's books on Hitler's Jewish soldiers, and I would be interesting to talk to him. I know Lowell Gallen was speaking with him, and I watched those interviews, although I wasn't able to keep a friendly working relationship with Lowell Gallen. And here, very, this book, William Shearer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, even Lex Friedman recommended this, of just the history, political, military of, we'll call it neutral, historically, morally neutral, just the history, the rise and fall of the Third Reich, Hitler, the road to power, the road to war, and the eventual decline of the Nazi Party, with over 1,000 pages plus your notes. So, like, huge book, over 1,000 pages. One of the definitive history books. I think it was written, like over 50 years ago. Even Lex Friedman was, I forget what, Ben Shapiro was mentioning this book. One of the most well-read, known books to just the historical documentation of the rise and fall of the Third Reich. And here, this is only partially on World War II, but I figured I'd show this History of the World in Our Times, Carol Quigley, that, I know Charles Moskowitz liked the book. Jay Dyer is also a big fan of the book, and it covers, the making of modern Europe with only a little bit of a focus on World War II in Germany and mostly the whole of Europe. But if you want to feel for what was going on in Europe, what were kind of the various ideas of what Europe should be, or drives and purposes to the different nations and the political agendas. Like I'd say, William Scher, just on the Third Reich, Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, for more of an overview of larger Europe. So HAPA, thanks for tuning in. So, as I said, these are all books that I've read. And another pile of books that I've read. So, I would have this with the other. Here's Business and Industry in Nazi Germany. That talks about the financial institutions, the bankings institute, and the Nazi operated companies where just nationalized most of the businesses and the corporate structure. Also a little bit about the appropriation of Jewish assets and Jewish slave labor, God forbid. So God forbid. Important book, Business and Industry in Nazi Germany by Nicosia and Huner. Here's a very well-known, popular book. Soroli, thanks for tuning in. I think that it's still loading the talk with Adam. I mean, it was, I guess, a productive conversation. It went over 4.5 hours. So, you could check that out, although you might have to wait another few hours till it loads on Odyssey, or he uploads it on BitChute. So, the Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland, God forbid, usually referring to the Holocaust of bullets, and the concept of ordinary men, of who these people were, how they were recruited, and what was the life like of these people who committed these horrible war crimes and killed people. And I think it even has like the daily routine, and so this is a well-known, popular book. I saw her on Lex Friedman, and actually I bought this book after she was on Lex Friedman, the New York Times writer, Annie Jacobson, Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America, where thousands of scientists that worked for the Nazis were recruited to come to America and work as scientists here in America, in all sorts of fields, including NASA and the space program. And it was referred to as Operation Paperclip. So important reading and understanding like U.S. policy and the direction of the war, and the United States government somewhat giving amnesty to possibly war criminals. Unclear whether the scientists were war criminals, but certainly Nazis that were actively in the Nazi government were given amnesty in order to come to America. And so a lot of Jews were given refuge, like Einstein and Oppenheimer, and that were famous scientists. But also, many Nazis were given amnesty to come to America and raise the level of science here in America. Here's Cornwell, Hitler's Scientists, Science War, and the Devil's Pact. And I've read more books than this that I haven't bought, but just skimmed online or in different places. And the role of science, physics, and so who are the main scientists? And you obviously have Heisenberg, that was in charge of the nuclear program. the gas and military physics, like God forbid, important reading. This is an extremely interesting book. He has another book too, uh, G.M. Gilbert, Nuremberg Diary. And he was a U.S. psychologist, army psychologist, and he was sent to Nuremberg after the war to give a psychological assessment of the Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg, many of them the most famous ones who were executed. And he did things including giving IQ tests and Warshire inkblot tests. And, I think the famous number 137, or like the average IQ, like Schock, the banker, was the smartest of the lot, but almost all, I think Stryker uh, had an average IQ, but almost all of the ranking Nazis scored extremely high on IQ tests. And, so God forbid, a Jewish United States Army psychiatrist that was in charge of making a psychiatric assessment of the captured war criminals in Nuremberg during the trials. God forbid. So a very interesting book, especially those people who like psychology. This is actually Kevin Roberts, my high school teacher at the Roper School, wrote a book, Schindler's Gift, about ADHD, where he determines and tries to assess that Schindler had ADHD, and then the role that ADHD played in Schindler's life. And 4 people have ADHD, to say how it could be detrimental, but it could also be beneficial, and how one man harnessed ADHD to change the world. So I was supposed to interview Kevin about this book. I know he had actually had like Schindler's daughter. I tried to introduce him to Lowell, and kind of fell apart. And I think he moved on. He wrote other books. So I got this autographed. It is wonderful to be back in touch. He said I was a student of. I wasn't his student in high school, but he was a teacher in the high school, and so props to him for writing this book. Very interesting book. Here's also an interesting book, Beryl Lang, Holocaust Representation, Art Within the Limits of History and Ethics, talking about artful representations of the Holocaust and the ethics and history of the use of artistic representations of the Holocaust. Here's the famous book by Father Du Bois, In Broad Daylight. And he actually came to the Detroit Institute of Arts. I didn't make it, but he came to Detroit and spoke. The Polish priest that was going around trying to find bodies or speak to witnesses of, God forbid, the Holocaust of bullets in the early period of World War I, where the Nazis were quickly taking over territory in Eastern Europe, and in the same ordinary men like Battalion 101, and the mass killing by bullets of Jews, God forbid, where we were gathered and brought to the side of the town and killed, and even digging up more bodies and speaking to elderly people that remember what happened. Here's the 7th million, the Israelis in the Holocaust, referring to the million, I guess, Holocaust survivors that made it to Israel, and how the legacy of the Holocaust looms large in Israeli life and politics. This is a pretty interesting book. This topic interested me quite a bit, and I've done some research on Hinduism. Hey, Pillator, good to see you. New religions and the Nazis, which, like, were the Nazis Hindu, pagans, Catholic, and so this talks about kind of the spiritual origins and theology behind the Nazis. So, one of my early interviews. I'm not sure what happened to her. Like, I'm not. I mean, God forbid she could, even be a counter Semite. But she wrote extremely good books. I interviewed her on my channel. It's one of my more popular interviews. Veronica Kuzniar, and it was actually this book that I think I bought, and I think she was on John Francis, the JF Greppi show, and I tweeted at her, and I asked to interview her, and she came on my channel, and we talked for hours. It was very interesting, and prolific author. I'm not sure if she's still writing, but I bought quite a few of her books. Veranda, so that's one of my more popular interviews. So here's her book on Kristallnacht. The anniversary of Kristallnacht was just recently. Nazi program or Zionist scheme, God forbid. So it's kind of counter-Semitic, but it goes over the evidence of what happened, what were the role that the Nazis played in analysis of the historical claims, and so I mean, I don't call her. Her take on it, but there's a lot of interesting documentation, and just trying to get to the facts of what actually happened, how it happened, and why did it happen. So I have quite a few of her books. Here is Albion and Zion United, which is a translation of Nazi propaganda literature about Jewish control of Britain, and claims that the British royal family are really Jewish. And so this was Nazi propaganda and translated from German into English about Jewish influence or control of the royal family or various parts of Britain. And here, Nation and Race. So a collection of articles of hers on nation and race, and she has a series of books on like Black Nazis and the question of Nazi racial theory, and Black allies or other questions. So like the concept of like Nazi Aryan supremacy, that is a popular folklore for what the Nazis believed. She goes more into detail, and tries to show that in reality the Nazis were multicultural, and there were Black Nazis and all sorts of collateral, and it's unclear whether the Nazis actually believed in racial supremacy. So it's interesting from the Judeo perspective or the American perspective, like what did the Nazis actually believe? It's tough to know. So I mean, God forbid if she has a more pro-Nazi perspective, but extremely well researched, and you want to get to the truth. A lot of insight from Veronica Kuzniar. I'm not sure what happened to her, but one of my more popular interviews on my channel. Spitz, Doctors from Hell, God forbid the horrific account of the Nazi experiments on humans. She was at the Nuremberg trials, and she talks about the horrible things, experiments that were not just done to Jews. Actually, probably only half of the, God forbid, experiments on Nazi experiments were on Jews, but some very creepy, dark stuff. But going over from her experience to being in Nuremberg, to the war crime trials and proceedings and eventual execution, and the cases, the high altitude experiments, freezing experiments, God forbid the using prostitutes and sex to bring men back to life after being frozen. And most of these people didn't survive these experiments. The malaria experiments, bone, muscle, nerve regeneration, bone transplantation experiments, mustard gas experimentation, sulfonamide experimentation, seawater experimentation, sterilization, jaundice, typhus, poison, bomb, phlegmon, polygol, and phenol experiments. God forbid, Jewish skeleton collections, euthanasia, very dark stuff, God forbid. A very detailed report, from a woman who was at the Nuremberg trials of the horrible medical experiments that were conducted on people, and people like Dr. Mengele, and really that's just a part of it. And so there were a lot of them. A lot of the people died. A lot of them survived and testified at the Nuremberg trials. So a lot of these doctors were executed and God forbid, punished for their crimes through the testimony of people who survived these experiments. God forbid. It's another important topic. Nazi persecution of the Gypsies by Louis. So, people know that, God forbid, after the Jews, the second largest group to suffer in, from the Holocaust were Gypsies. So this is about the persecution of the Gypsies, the pre-war years, and, to leading to the bringing the Gypsies to the camp and the decision to exterminate them and the extermination, what camps they were done, and God forbid. So persecution of the Gypsies by Louis. So here, it's Edwin Black books. So I have these autographed, I think. To David, The Legacy of Hate, God forbid. This is 18. So Edwin Black. I also have War Against the Weak and Eugenics. To David, The Science Was a Scam. I have pictures with Edwin Black. So, if he came back to Detroit, he was an interesting man to speak with. The transfer agreement. I showed that book earlier, and where he mentioned that he had 2 more volumes that he chose not to print because he didn't want to make Israel look bad. But, this book, important book, Root of the Arab-Nazi Alliance and the Holocaust, going back to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem till after the war, of the connection that of Nazi alliances with various Arab nations, and the post-Nazi alliances that continued with Nazi war criminals being fed into places like Egypt and Syria. And so very well researched, although these books are obviously biased to some extent, but extremely well researched and important topic. The Farhud, Roots of the Arab Nazi Alliance and the Holocaust, and also a very well researched important book, War Against the Weak, Eugenics and Americans' Campaign to Create a Master Race, which shows that eugenics, and this is also kind of biased because, God forbid, Jews were also big proponents of eugenics, and even to some extent, eugenics was just as much or more popular among Jews. I even mentioned Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch making kind of pro-eugenic statements. So, it doesn't cover that part, but the history of the eugenics movement, and then how that was taken over by the Nazis. God forbid, very important books. We have these autographed from Mr. Black himself. So those are the books that I have on my shelves. And 1 second, let's check my phone. So I have a stack of books that I've bought but haven't read. So I'll show these here, and maybe I'll have time at some point to read them. And then, I don't know if there's any questions or someone wants to hop on, or maybe I'll give some, concluding thoughts. So, God forbid, I bought this book at actually at Eichler's. I bought this book at Eichler's in Borough Park, Perfidy by Ben Hecht, which is a Jewish anti-Zionist book that also it was actually banned in Israel for a period of time, and talks about, God forbid, Zionist collaboration in the Holocaust. And it's an important topic, and for just to realize that there were Jews that cooperated with the Nazis. It was a horrible thing, horrible crime, but there were in fact some Jews that didn't seem to mind or even helped in the killing of their brethren. And so this book was actually banned in Israel for a period of time. I'd skimmed through it, but I forgot about it, so I put it in the pile to read again and never got to doing it. Here is another book by Father Du Bois, The Holocaust by Bullets. So I'd read his other book. This one I hadn't read. And, similar to Ordinary Men, the Battalion 101, referring to the first part of the war, or, Raoul Hilberg covers this. Father Du Bois, The Holocaust by Bullets. Haven't read this one. This one's a very famous book. Peter Novick's The Holocaust in American Life. Like I showed, the 7th million. But the Holocaust is generally polled and probably the single most important factor in Jewish life today, even more so than the religion itself. And so, this is a very well-known book. Luke Ford even mentioned it, but I haven't actually read it yet. So I bought it and hadn't read it. This is back when I was at Stony Brook, a long time ago. This was like a textbook, the Second War in the Far East. And I think I had Europe also. I'm not sure where it went. Oh yeah, here it is also. So I bought these books when I was in Stony Brook. I didn't take the history class, but I'd skim through them. Like time is short. But, so this is just pure World War II history books, the Second World War in Europe and the Far East. I sell books. I have a whole bunch of books for sale on, World War II. I had like books on planes and tanks and stuff. I didn't have time to read it. So just like pure, like I sell them. So people check my eBay page. So, like pure military books about commanders. And, so I was more interested, God forbid, in the Holocaust and the World War II itself. And, both my grandfathers served in the U.S. Army World War II, and, read constantly my probably the most main subject that both my grandfathers read about was World War II, but they read more like, the actual military struggle and, what was going on in the minds of the commanders in the battlefields like Normandy and D-Day and various things that relatively I actually don't know that much about. So, and as I actually have quite a few books on the topic for sale, I sold most of these books. I had books that covered like, war tankers, airplanes, Japanese airplanes, and various things. And I skimmed through them and looked through them, but God forbid, I'm not an Army guy, and like trying to understand, how the Air Force or tank battalions or the logistics of how the battles actually went was, time is too limited. But, like God forbid, I went to school, yeshivas, like I know many Holocaust survivors, God forbid. And, so that was a topic very important, as opposed to the actual fighting of the armies. Here's another book. I bought this when I was at Stony Brook, a university book. This one's very popular. Taylor's The Origins of the Second World War, which I haven't read actually, but I bought. This is a well-known book. God forbid, Aaron Einhorn, a local journalist here in Metro Detroit. I think I have this. Do I have this autograph? Yeah, I have it autographed. To David, Treasure Family Memories and Folklore. Aaron Einhorn, she spoke at the downtown synagogue, and this is her story. And she went into Poland and tried to find her past, and even try to like recover family property. And God forbid, it's a horrible story. Like I think her grandmother and her sister that maybe even been twins. One had red hair and blue eyes, and the other dark features. And the light-featured one was able to be taken in and raised together with a Polish family. The darker-featured one was left to die. Maybe it was even her mother, God forbid, and her grandfather had a building that he signed over to a Polish friend of his, and then she looked into trying to get the building back, and so God forbid, this is the story of her family during the war, and then going to Poland and looking into possibly trying to get her family property back. So I got this autograph. She spoke at the downtown synagogue. I didn't actually have a chance to read this, but Aaron Einhorn's a popular journalist here in Metro Detroit and is occasionally on PBS. Here, Martin Gilbert, Kristallnacht, Prelude to Destruction. So I didn't actually have a chance to read this. I have, I read Kuznar's book on Kristallnacht. The anniversary of Kristallnacht was just recently. So, hopefully I'll have time to read this. God forbid, important topics, but time is limited. God forbid, Waxman's The History of the Nazi concentration camps. Dark stuff. I think this is a pretty well-known, popular book that covers pretty in-depth the creation of the concentration camps, and God forbid, another Butler. I think I have the other Butler book that I read. This one, Legions of Death: The Nazi Enslavement of Europe. I think talks a little bit about slave labor and murder, just horrible stuff. Historical documentation of some of the horrible tragedies that happened World War II. So that's all of my. Oh no, sorry. So here, this also, I think I have this autographed. Morris Wolf to David, warm regards. He spoke at the Isaac Agree Downtown Synagogue. Whatever happened to Raoul Wallenberg, the true story of the Holocaust hero Raoul Wallenberg, and the author's efforts to rescue him from Soviet Union imprisonment. And I think I skimmed through this, and he claims to have some sort of information. And the Wahlberg family, his mysterious disappearance, his supposed imprisonment in Russia, possible speculations about his surviving and what happened to him. So this is a local Detroit man who wrote a book about Wallenberg, and he made attempts to find out what happened to him and wrote a book about it. God forbid, interesting Nazi Germany, health, race, naked Germany, health, race, and the nation. And you kind of like, it's almost pornographic where you have like gatherings of Nazis naked, and interesting part of the war where like eugenics and fit and kind of like these health camps where people would like run around naked, or everyone would be naked, and it's kind of weird stuff, just like what was happening actually within Nazi Germany. It looked interesting. I bought it, never had a chance to read it. I think I actually bought this at Stony Brook also as a university textbook, but never had a chance to read it. And, God forbid, Breitman's The Architect of Genocide, Himmler and the Final Solution. Never had a chance to read this. God forbid, Dark Stuff, Himmler and the Final Solution. Here, Hollywood traitors, blacklisted screenwriters, agents of Stalin, allies of Hitler. So, like here's Adam Green or, Kanye West, and talking about, Jewish management representation in Hollywood. But for a period of time, Nazis, Germans were very powerful in Hollywood. There was elements of the Nazi Party in Hollywood. There was agreements between the Nazi government and Hollywood. And so I haven't had a chance to read this, but just like the history of Germans in Hollywood and Nazis or Nazi collaborators in Hollywood, God forbid. Here's another one from Stony Brook that I bought when I was a student and never read, Sexuality in German Fascism. And, kind of like their view, because they weren't like a Christian movement. They had legalized prostitution and various things. So just a look of, God forbid, sexuality during World War II. Hey, Memes, thanks for tuning in. Here, another one by Yaffa Elik of Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. There Was Once a World, a 900-year chronicle of the shtetl of Ishak. So this is one Jewish shtetl that Eastern Europe that was founded 900 years ago and was destroyed during the war. And it's a huge book, a history through the destruction and the war. Yafa, like I think author most famous of Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. Um, Here's another one on comic books. I mentioned the one. This is also co-written by Raphael Medov. We spoke out comic books in the Holocaust and the relation to a lot of the uh, original Holocaust, original comic books were kind of like anti-Nazi propaganda, or a lot of them were Jews that used comic books to try to arouse the U.S. public to take seriously the threat of the Nazis or support the U.S. military efforts. Um, I never had a chance to read this book, all dusty. I bought this years ago. Very interesting, important. Like before I even spoke to Veronica Kuzniar, the East came west, Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist volunteers in the German armed forces, like Subra Chandra's Bose. But, this kind of myth or understanding of the Nazis and the supposed Aryan supremacy, which may or may not be accurate. It may kind of be just what we tell ourselves as our side of how we understand it. But the reality is the Nazis were um, a multicultural international force that had many soldiers from different ethnicities fighting for them or with them, and even within Germany, not just allies outside of Germany and other countries, but even in Germany, they had many Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist volunteers in the German forces, and not even conscripts, but people who volunteered for the Nazi army. So these are the books that I haven't read yet. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to talk. I'll put the link in the chat. I might ramble a tiny bit, or I might just wrap up relatively soon. It's a pretty dark topic, but one of the bigger sections that I have books on. So I have close to 100 books on the Holocaust, and I've read a lot of them, and I've read tens of books online. I actually, in my Judaica section, I wouldn't call them books on the Holocaust, but they're more like IC3.
Greetings.
Hey,
heavy topic.
Yeah, God forbid. So, I've been trying to stream more. So I started a weekly show on, I first called it Books That Changed My Life, but just tour my library and some of my books. And, so I was pushing this off, but, it's an important topic and something that, God forbid, as someone who went to Jewish schools as a Jew, it's one of the single most important topics to us. So, I've read and thought a lot about it. So I thought I'd share, my book collection on the subject.
Yes, it's very serious. So let me know, based on all the information you and the experience and the books that you've read, I've heard. I'd like to hear your opinion on these world views that I've been coming across. Some the most deep one I've come across is basically the idea that there's a fight basically between a unipolar world, what they call a unipolar world order, or versus a multipolar world order. So that seems to be the two main camps. And those that are talking about those two main camps, they're basically saying that what happened in Nazi Germany, what caused the Second World War and the First World War, is about to happen again, because the big plan by those mainly with financial power, is to set up or control Israel or the Middle East or that area of the world, so that they can control trade coming from the east to Africa, from Africa coming from Africa up to Europe and so on. So basically the control of the world from that central part, perceived to be the central part of the world. And how it relates to what you're saying today is that they believe that the underlying philosophy of the people that have this global view is that they have to get Jews to Israel or out of the West, basically out of other parts of the world, and bring them with all their intelligence and all their knowledge and information to help them construct this central global empire. And their earlier attempts to do that, they say, was the Second World War, by financing Hitler in order to drive the Jews out of Germany and to drive them to Israel to help construct something. So basically, like you were saying earlier on, so what's the word? So even if some Jews die or suffer as a result of the generation of hatred against them, it's the end justifies the means, as it's encouraging the Jews to unite and come towards to rebuild greater Israel. Do you understand what I'm saying there? That plan, that view?
Yeah, I mean, like, God forbid, I covered a handful of books that talked about Zionist or Jewish collaboration with the Nazis.
Yeah.
And if you think to recognize that, okay, the Jews have enemies, possibly there's people who are counter-Semitic, but there's also, so to say, Jewish traitors, people who are willing to conspire, even including the mass murder of their fellow Jews, in a search for power, or even possibly in a search for the creation of a Jewish state.
Right. But can you call those people? Go on.
I mean, when I'm talking the history, generally, I'm avoiding intent, because you can't really know the intentions of people or why they do things. So, like history, we know, things that were done, things that happened, who was involved, who did what, maybe even interest, to say the interest of different people and the interest of different sides. But when you start speculating on intent, it becomes much
more complicated,
much more difficult, because you can't really know a person's intent. You could know what they said, maybe if they they publicly claim their intent, like you say, something like Hitler or something like that, was okay. What did Hitler intend? Was, well, because he said it, or people who speculate, experts. But that's why generally you have to avoid intent, because it's purely speculative, and then you're speculating. Oh, but the intent is world domination, and that's why I made the point. Like, okay, what was the intent of the Nazis? And it's tough to know. There's a conglomeration of forces, and when you have a larger movement, there's a lot of people working in conjunction. And if you're talking, okay, like Jews who conspired together with Nazis, why'd they do it? And it could be a whole bunch of reasons. Because maybe did they hate their fellow Jew that much that they were willing to team up with the Nazis, or was it just for their own self-benefit, where they're willing to sacrifice, or even to any power that you'll be? So yeah, I mean, generally, I would have avoid the intent question, because it's too speculative. And if you're going to try to understand what's happening now, World War II is an important lesson. Like Gary Kasparov and The Winter is Coming, and all these examples. American politics. It's like Germany, 1930. Things are much different, and that's why when COVID-19 hit, I stopped studying the Holocaust, World War II so much because I saw that it's not going to play out like then. There's too many factors. Like multiculturalism. Now there's a powerful state of Israel. You're just watching Netanyahu on Glenn Beck. Israel is the eighth most powerful country in the world. In some ways, Israel's military, some people have ranked as surpassed Germany's and Japan. And so if there's going to be a rise in anti-Semitism or war, what would happen in America? And now where you have Israel as one of the most powerful armies in the world, how that would play in effects in a term like a global order, where it's unlikely that there's going to be a global order because you have nations that have divergent interests. And even though you could speculate, well, what if you could just get a few people, the elites from various forces, to work together with each other? It's unlikely that would happen. And if you look at Russia, Ukraine, things are spiraling into war. There'll be some level of corrupt elites working across borders and just sending the peasants off to kill each other for business interests, corporations. But it's more likely to be factionalization. And when war breaks loose, you don't know who it's going to be in your benefit to work together with and team up with. That there might be many reasons, like Black-Jewish relations or various things where there was a period of time where it was beneficial to work together, and then from group interests, now maybe not so beneficial to work together. So the intent, motives and intent is very difficult. I think it's more logical to reasonable to talk about group interests than group motives and intent. And then you have the rational actor, where you assume that people are rational actors and are acting in their own best interest or the group self-interest. And sometimes people act in individual interest and will go against their own group, but usually people act in their group self-interest. But you could also interpret things that saying that people are not rational actors, and saying like anti-Semitism or racism or various things, or nationalism. People argue how rational or actually beneficial to people's own self-interest. And then the question, well, if it's not in the people's own self-interest, why do they do it? And so you could give different explanations for why people would act in a way that are against their own self-interest.
Okay, so listen to what you just said there. It made a question come up in my mind actually. Intent. Okay, very important word there. Intent. Now, what do you see?
So motives and intent.
Yeah, motives. Okay, motives and intent. Now, what is the relationship between intent and identity? You see, that's what I'd like to explore. Because the relationship between intent and identity, because based on like, for example, what does it mean to be Jewish? So those people who were sacrificing the so-called other Jews, what is Jewish identity in that context? You see, when you relate it to what you're saying in motives and intent. See, so what is it? How do you see the relationship between intent and identity, based on the things that you were saying?
You could only theoretically. So like, okay, you got to have the multiple truth hypothesis, and say it's speculative because it's the hard problem of consciousness, and we don't really know. So if you want to say that your group identity determines your motives, that okay, like, well, you have dark skin and are part of the black people, therefore I can infer your motives of you having self-interest in your group identity, but that may or may not be accurate. And you might have your individual proclivities, or you may be willing to sell out your larger group for your own individual benefit. And it's okay. You're like, you're not an African. You're a Brit. You're you're not a citizen of any nation of Africa. You're a citizen of the British government. And just like most Jews, they were citizens of European governments, not of Israel. But if you're going to examine self-interest and say, well, I'm assuming that you want to act in your own self-interest and your identity and group is going to play in what's in your self-interest, and an objective outsider could determine without talking to you by just saying, well, okay, you're Jew, you're a black man, so I know some basis of the general interest of your group, and therefore I can infer your motives of what's best for you and why you might be acting in the way that you're acting, because you're interested in advancing your personal self-interest and your group self-interest. And then the question of identity is very difficult, because you say, okay, well, am I a Jew or am I American? Am I like a libertarian or a chess player? Voluntary parts of my identity versus inborn parts or my group identity. And we've discussed this in the past, like when war breaks out, a lot of time against our will, you fall into the group. So a lot of Jews were largely assimilated and didn't have a strong Jewish identity. But once the war breaks out, that the Jewish identity becomes, well, I mean, actually my Jewish identity is pretty important. And it said, like, well, if Britain goes to war against Africa, and like there you are, a black man in London, whose side are you going to be on? So I mean, technically, you're on the side of London. So if London goes to war against Africa, you should be on the side of England against Africa, because well, I'm a black man. My ancestors came from Africa. I'm on the side of Africa, and you have these complications of mixed identity. And then if you've built up wealth or have a stake, you're like, okay, I'm on the side of the Jews, but I've built up wealth and position here in America, and if I take the side of the Jews in a conflict of interest for America, I risk at what's stake with my stake here in America. And so when war gets closer, like Russia, demand allegiance, and you have to denounce Russia, and various things. It's very complicated.
Right. Okay. So basically, you were saying
talking about the war and the Holocaust. Like I said, like the books on Briggs' books on Hitler's Jewish soldiers. So
yeah,
and that
that's right.
A lot of people are shocked. I was shocked when I read, but it's saying like literally tens of thousands of Jews were Nazi officers, including quarter and half Jews, but there were thousands of full 100% Jews that were Nazis. And
yes, that's right.
You could put a logic to
reading that.
Yeah, I mean it's not to mention, okay, there could have been Zionist Jews who cooperated with the Nazis, but just saying that German Jewish citizens that whatever reason decided to team up with Germany full-fledged into the war to waging war against their own people. And certainly that happened with the British in Africa in the colonies. And I covered that in my last stream about Freemasonry in England, where Freemasonry was largely used first to help the British have collaborators in the countries they colonized. And a lot of times those people who became Freemasons eventually rebelled against them. But the British were only successful in that extent because they found collaborators that were willing to team up with them against their own people.
Yeah. Right. So therefore, then the relationship between intent and identity, that you see them as being bound up, basically. Intent is an aspect of identity. You're saying, yeah?
No, I'm saying that motive and intent is unknowable. So I'm theorizing on intent. That's why I'm saying for history, you're better off just avoiding the question of motive and intent, because you're never going to know. And
so does that mean that identity is unknowable as well then?
Well, no, I mean, identity is somewhat knowable. You could say, well, I mean, to some extent, you could argue, you would say, well, are you a black man or not? So, like, I don't really know. Maybe what does it mean? Like, I'm looking at you. Your skin looks kind of dark. You've told me about your family history and being from the Caribbean and your African heritage. But you say, well, maybe you're not a black man. Maybe, maybe you have some sort of family history that you don't know yourself. But I say, no, I mean, with that extent, identity is more knowable that you say, okay, this person's part of this group. This person, saying, okay, I'm a university graduate. I have, these parents, like the different aspects of my identity are objectively observable to a third party. Uh, However, motive and intent is never objectively observable to a third party, and it's questionable whether a person themselves could really know their motives and intent. So you say, well, I told you my motives and intent, so you know my motives and intent, but your knowledge of my motives and intent is completely based on what I told you. And then if you're just using logic or you're using a theory, a solution to the hard problem of consciousness or a theory of identity that makes sense, where you could infer motives from identity. But I think generally motives are inferred from identity, and
Okay.
so you could know about identity, but the to infer motives and intent from identity is already a step away, and it's less less evidence based.
Right. So therefore, then, like Neely Fuller says, basically, the system of white supremacy, he's saying, is really the most powerful um, ideology and concept in the world that overrides all religions. It kind of supersedes all religions. So people, it kind of fits with what you're just saying, because if people just, if it's more powerful to judge somebody's intent by their appearance, then
Well, by their identity.
yeah.
I mean, you
Yes,
could judge
their
their
identity.
identity by their appearance, but I'm saying that could be a false judgment. You could assume somebody's white when they're just appear to be white, or I mean, if you're talking power structures like critical theory, where it's okay, the most powerful entity for a period of time was European countries, powers, corporations, and those are largely controlled by, so to say, white people. So the white identity is the most powerful identity, but that's temporal to a period of time and subject to change. There's that the decline of the West, where the white identity, if it confers membership in some sort of power structure, but power structures rise and fall. So like Scheer's book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and you can't write the book yet, The Rise and Fall of the West, but you could conceive that the rise and fall of the West and the white identity will bear less value. That what does that gain you? What were you?
If the West falls, then, because if whiteness, or the concept of whiteness, or the concept of white identity is an necessary aspect of the West, then when the West falls, or if the West falls, then but then again, the concept of whiteness could then move from the West into another realm, as it were. But do you see whiteness as a necessary aspect of West, the construct of the West?
No, I think whiteness is kind of a fake construct, but if it was a barrier to entry to power structures, and say that largely that barrier to entry has been lifted, and saying that that me and you are bearers of the West, and there might be power limitations, and maybe there's more power limitations on you than me, due to God forbid, racism or white privilege, but in essence, you're a bearer of the West. You're part of the West, even if you're excluded from power structures, and that's more and more changing as whiteness is less and less representative of power in the West. And like I was saying, that the Nazis were factually multicultural. They might have had ideology of white supremacy, but the actual Nazis themselves, in many ways, were multicultural. And you said that there might be elements of white supremacy in the West, but factually, the West is multicultural. It's just saying, okay, well, who's the prime minister of the UK? I mean, it's not a white man; it's an Indian man. It's a dark skinned man, and and you say, well, is he a representative of white people, or he's a representative of London, which has nothing to do with whiteness? It's just historically, or there's an element of historically a ratio of white people, English people in that land. But when you look at who's in power, I mean, there's still the king and the royal family, but the mayor of London's and the prime minister of England are no longer white people.
That's right. That's right. So, so
And
then,
saying like they say like you yourself are saying, well, what are you? You're not African. You're the West. Your ancestors may have came from Africa, but you're not representative of Africa. You're representative of the UK.
okay. So let's explore that a bit. Okay, the West. So because I'm in the West and I'm eating and sleeping in the West, you're saying I'm part of the West. Okay, but do you accept the possibility that there can be people who are in the West, but they do not actually constitute um, the the pillars of what the West is? So, for example, you could have if you have
In
a
power
house or you
structure.
have a space, you got pets, dogs or cats in your house. It doesn't mean that they're actually are they part of the household? Is if if you're holding a farm, you can say yes. Um, the farm or the household, the animals are part of the household, but
Yeah, but I'm saying you have full British citizenship, right? You're not like a pet or animal, so you have full British citizenship.
yes.
And you
So
could say there might be racism, there might be institutional racism, there might be people who don't like the fact that you have full British citizenship. But I mean, the fact is, legally, you are representative of British. I mean, you don't have
of
citizenship in any
Britain,
African. You don't have citizenship in any African country. You're not representative of Africa by any means. You're representative of Britain, and there might be alliances. There might be uh, nationalists that don't like that or want to change it. Just like Jews in Germany didn't. Israel didn't exist, and the only citizenship they had was Germany. And then God forbid we were stripped of our citizenship, and uh, you could say, okay, what power levels do people currently have? So you go, you have full citizenship, but how much institutional power do you have in London? I mean, God forbid the African man who was finance minister or whatever under uh, Prime Minister Truss for like a few weeks before she
that's
resigned.
right.
But I
Yeah.
mean, there was a few week period, where the African descent man was one of the most powerful people in the finance minister. Uh, but yeah, I mean, all of these are temporal relationships, and war, famines, migrations could happen to anybody, and power structures are always temporary and subject to change. You say there's certain parts of identity that are permanent. Um, if you say, okay, my identity is Jewish based on thousands of years of my mother's ancestry, but that's subject to change because my mother married a non-Jew. I'm only half Jew. If I married a non-Jew, my children will only be quarter Jewish. But like that aspect of my identity is immutable. As for citizenship, like okay, I'm an American citizen. I was brought up in an area that's mutable. God forbid governments could change. They could change the ruling of citizenship. I could move to Israel, or something else that's changeable, or wealth, the acquisition of power. you could gain or lose wealth, or you could gain or lose uh, power. And then, the question of the barriers to entry. How easy is it for a person to gain or lose power or wealth? And what aspect of their identity might um, hamper or help a person gain or lose power or wealth?
Okay. So then, in your view of the world and how the world works, you see it as basically
I'm more
any.
pontificate. I don't have like a clear rule view. I'm saying this is how it works. I'm more a student, and I say the multiple truth hypothesis, where I'll say like I don't know, I don't have definitive answers, so I'm just giving you possibilities, or maybe like scholarship, where these are like the main theories that scholars have postulated. But like by no means do I have a theory that I'm putting forward as being true or necessarily better than other theories.
Right, right. Okay. So uh, what do you see as the most likely theory that you're saying there's multiple groups of people with multiple ideas and ideologies, and how do you see power? How does power work based on int- its relationship between intent and identity? How does intent and identity relate to power in your view?
Well, I mean, you have to come on to the question of high or low birth, because you say that people take higher or lower birth, meaning say that people be born closer to power or further to power, more opportunity to gain or lose power, and that's one of the unknown questions related to the question of evil. Why do good things happen to bad people, or bad things happen to good people? Which is like rich dad, poor dad. Why are people born into power and some other people born into uh, suffering, or why do some people have an easier time rising to the top and other people a more difficult time, with an unclear relationship to meritocracy or good or bad? So there's not really any good answers to those questions. And say you look at a polarity of people being just opportunistic, and you say that people based on how high or low they take birth use their opportunity to uh, live the best life that they can. And then the polarity of conflict theory to natural goodness, where it's saying it's the natural order of people to compete against each other, and zero sum that someone else has, that means someone else doesn't have, and groups will conflict for power, and that's the natural order for there to be winners and losers, and conflict is natural way to determine who's going to be the winners or losers, versus more utopian idealistic approaches that doesn't necessitate conflict, and there might be a temporal status of people who've sort of say taken higher or lower birth, but it doesn't necessitate a constant state of conflict. So I mean, a lot of people, the Nazis generally had a conflict theory that conflict is the natural order, and war and struggle is the natural condition of man. And so if you want something, you have to take it, and you have to use force, and there's going to be pushback for other groups, and so a more naturalistic interpretation of violence, war, and force. So I would just say the schools of thought are along these polarities, and so you have to look into the question of good and evil, of high birth and low birth, and then the question of the role of struggle. Is struggle the natural understanding of how power arises, or are there non-struggle approaches to obtaining power, or wealth, and then related to motive and intent? You just say, are people naturally opportunistic? You're saying, well, some people are good, some people are bad, some people make more moral decisions, some people are by power, other people are motivated, or you say there's a natural inclination in all people, that all people have an opportunistic desire for power and prosperity, and willingness to hurt other people, or individual free will, where some people are more moral, and So there are a whole bunch of unknowns, and I can't answer any of these questions. I could say a belief system, say my approach, and that's why I put forward the multiple truth hypothesis, because it's almost nonsensical to try to say this is how it works, and then you have the difficulty of explaining history using that theory. You're saying, well, this is how people operate, and this is why World War II happened and the Holocaust happened, and this is why current events today are happening the way they are. In a more scholarly approach, we're like, nah, there's a whole bunch of possibilities, and even World War II and the Holocaust, it's mostly unknowns. Even for a scholar, there's still more questions than answers, let alone with what's going to happen now, let alone with the hard problem of consciousness. And that's why I put the theological question that comes down to the main question of evil, the unanswered question of why do some people take high birth, why do some people take low birth.
Okay. So do you have a moral position?
Well, I have inclinations, but it's saying like, no, I mean, morality. My impression is the material realm is neutral to morality, and like I'm a dualist. I believe that there's a God and there's action reaction. Um, but like the question, if the tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? To a moral question, if someone kills another person and there's no witnesses and they don't feel sorry about it, can they get away with it? And I accept that there's no definitive answer on that question of morality. Is the universe neutral to morality, or do we live in a moral based universe? Are the righteous rewarded and the wicked are punished? And does that mean like if someone's suffering that they deserved it, and if someone's prospering they deserved it? Or you say that there's other forces, that the world is unjust, naturally unjust, or are you saying that the world has is naturally unjust, but you could fight to make it more unjust, even though it's naturally unjust? So I would just say that we really have no knowns, but we have belief systems, and a lot of that's based on religion. And I say, well, what do the Jewish sages or the philosophers teach? How did they interpret it? Versus how do I try to live my life? Saying that okay, I would desire power and bounty, but I um, refrain myself according to moral principle because I believe in right and wrong. Because maybe because I'm scared of punishment, I believe in karma. That if I do something wrong, I will be caught and held accountable in this world, and I'll be punished in the next world. Versus someone, like you say, like, no, I'm pretty convinced that you can do bad things and get away with it. That you might believe that there's a moral system, but the scientific reality is unfortunately you could do bad things and get away with it. There is no the universe bending towards the arc of justice.
So you believe? So do you personally have a moral system then? I
Yeah,
understood what everything you said.
I personally subscribe to morality and believe to supernatural forces that control morality in a dualistic manner. That the material realm is morally neutral, and then there's a spiritual realm that includes karma and action reaction based on what we'll call good and bad, moral or immoral. And there's certain factors that could reincarnation beyond our understanding, why people take low birth or high birth, how God, so to say, runs the world in terms of the reward of the righteous or punishment of the wicked. That we know that I hold that we know certain principles or understanding, maybe through prophecy, the sages, rationality, but in essence, it's a mystery. We don't know how God runs the world. So I believe in morality, but I don't believe that we could really understand it.
Right, right. And
I don't know. I don't know your take on it. I mean, if you think
yeah,
that,
yeah. My take on it is that I have strong opinions of things that I think are wrong, but I don't understand the source. Like for example, the concept of uh, gender change or sex change of children, based on what the children's view, So if the child feels like, oh, they feel like a girl and they're a boy, then they should be able to have the right, as it were, to tell their school teacher or the government, and then that child have its sex changed, and the child might feel a year later that they want to be changed back to a boy again, and then the child has the right to go through another operation. So therefore,
when we're talking war, we could, God forbid, just talk straight up murder and just say, well, I believe murder is wrong, and
yeah.
and that there's a God who punishes people for murder, but do you believe that there's a naturalistic aspect of karma? Is it possible that people could murder and get away with it, and you just believe that there's a God that punishes people, but in all possibility, or do you think like you believe that like, no, you can't sin and get away with it, from if it's gender to straight up murder, thievery, rape, and to say that that there might be societal rules that punish murderers, but is there something metaphysical that causes what comes around to go around, for the righteous to be rewarded, the wicked to be punished? Or is it possible that someone could be a horrible person, a murderer and thief, and get away with it because there is no force in the universe that actually stops them?
Yeah, how I'd answer that is
I
that
mean,
I
you believe
feel,
that there is some force, and like, what's the origin of that force? Is it God, or so that, I mean, it's an important question on, I argue with atheists, they're just straight up, the question of murder. Can a person murder and get away with it, or is there a God and some sort of karmatic force that, like, factually, like, no, you
I
can't
believe
murder and
there
get away?
is, yeah, I believe there is some kinetic force, and how I believe it works is that humanity itself has a kind of collective memory, um, and that uh, and that when if you do something wrong, then somehow that act is remains part of your memory and part of your construct, and also reflects on the society that you're in, and then the children of that society. And so that action of murder um, somehow uh, remains in the society, and it impacts the people who you're related to, and it also impacts the society, and that society's relationship to other societies, and so it goes into the collective human memory, and perhaps even more, and so it will manifest, it will come back um, in some form further down the line, or maybe even um, immediately, even though you don't perceive it. So
I mean,
that's
so I
that's
argue that necessitates a divine force. Just human memory isn't enough. I mean, because maybe some crimes are outside of human memory.
yeah.
Saying, if God forbid, a person kills their foe and there's no evidence and there's no witnesses and the person doesn't feel bad about it, that it's only that given person's memory, and there might not be any knowledge besides it. So it requires some external force, be it God or karma, to keep track and
Yes, that's
balance
right.
it. And then the
Yes,
question,
that's right.
like, history is written by the victors, and the question is, is justice a man-made construct that in reality is false, that we desire justice, but justice is something that eludes us and we could never have? Or are you saying that justice is something that's built into the universe, and even if the man-made system cannot create justice, that some godly force uh, um, balances forces out to resolve justice?
I think the second one, the second point you're making, there is some force. How it works, I don't know. I don't know. So what would be your position? The second one that you just mentioned, or the first one?
Well, the second one, I'm a believer. But I'm saying I'm a
Right.
rationalist, and I realize that it's hard to prove, and you could interpret the evidence. So it's I'm looking. I believe the evidence supports my interpretation of the world and the historical view of the facts. So he's saying that if you say I'm going to have a morally neutral opinion towards history, where we say good and bad are constructs of the mind that may or may not be accurate. It's possible that you could act bad and gain from acting bad, and there's nothing that evens things out. But if you believe that like a Judeo precept that the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished, then you have to factor that into your interpretation of history and current events. Versus you take approach where I just believe that the righteous are rewarded or the wicked are punished, but from a rational perspective, I recognize that that may not be true. Or versus like maybe like T jump or an atheist and just say that's 100% false. There's no connection at all to the righteous being rewarded or the wicked being punished, and it's just a silly belief that people, a religious origin that people use to comfort themselves, but is in essence completely false. And any attempt to transplant that view on history or current events is necessarily false. Like, okay, well, like Russia and Ukraine. Well, I think Ukraine's going to win because they're the good guys because Putin, acted wrong and immorally, and therefore, Ukraine's going to win. Say, well, what does that have to do with rationality? What does it matter whether Putin's the good guy or the bad guy? Whether he wins or loses is based on other factors that has absolutely nothing to do with good or bad. And
Right.
you like power relations that those with power are more likely to win, and those who are good, and then you can have a system where you say, well, it must be that the people who are in power because they're good, and so that's the question of high or low birth. That well, the people are in power are largely in power because they took higher birth, and that it could be identity with like okay like white privilege and the power structures make it easier to rise to power if you're white, and so a person who's white so to say took higher birth, and therefore it's easier for them to acquire power. And then it's just the question, well, why do some people take higher lower birth, or an individual level like someone's parents are billionaires or generals, or physical capabilities that what does it mean that the power is there for the taking, and you're going to assume either that there's a connection between goodness and power. You could assume the opposite. There's an inverse connection between goodness and power, that in fact I think that the people in power are generally bad and good people tend not to have power. So whatever reason the people have power, it's not because they're good. In fact, it's because they're bad, or it's neutral. There's no connection between being good and bad and power. You obtain power through various methods, and it's completely neutral to whether you're a good person or a bad person. You could be a good person and obtain power. You could be a bad person, obtain power. You could be a good or bad person and have no power. So I don't know. You think that they're related or connected, power and goodness, or there's an inverse
Okay.
relation?
Yeah. So how I'd address that, just listen to you speak there. I was thinking that um, it, I'm just shooting from from the hip now. Just thinking that there appears to be like two worlds, as it were. So there's the world, the construct of the world, where those are believers, and then there's another world operating in parallel, and that's the world of total materialism. So basically, good would mean that you're making a profit. That means so that material world of good and bad can be seen and measured precisely um, through finance. So like there's a financial ecosystem. There's a financial world, and that world is an ecosystem within itself. And within that world, that financial ecosystem, then you can measure it precisely. So if your wealth, if the money you own is and the property you own is increasing in value, then that is good. If you're losing money, then that is bad. So that's good and evil can be seen in a purely materialistic way as part of if you're part of that world ecosystem. And faith in that world refers to faith in investments. You're taking a chance, so you take high risk, you got high reward. So you have good faith that somebody will be able to pull off this business deal or be able to run the thing effectively. So you invest. So faith is manifested in investment. So I can see that material world ecosystem as complete in itself. And then those people who live inside that financial ecosystem, they'll see anybody who lives outside it, the people of faith in the invisible, as somewhat insane, because I imagine they'd see us as living in a dream world. So, what do you think of that as two parallel worlds?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was vague in my use of good and bad because, like, good and bad, like we talked, I think, on Claire's stream about the economic or the utilitarian, that economic, the word goods in terms of wealth acquisition, as opposed to a moralistic, like good behavior
Yes,
or
that's right.
treating your
Yeah.
fellow man
Oh, yeah, that's right.
good
I
good or
remember.
bad.
Yeah.
So if
Yes.
you're talking about the moralistic, like a person's moral or amoral versus power and wealth, and is there a connection? You say, like, the Maimonides Jewish precept that the righteous get rewarded and the wicked get punished, and like even saying that, well, God forbid, like the Holocaust, God is just. That the one thing I know is God is just, and if a person suffers, that they must have deserved it because God is just, and that if a person has wealth and power, they must have deserved it because God is just. And then you could come on to subsystems of heaven and hell, reincarnation, greater purposes to say why things don't appear to be like the way they are. Or some Christian, you have inverse systems where you say generally, instead of using good or bad, use the word moral or amoral, where wealthy and powerful people are generally amoral, and there's a connection between amorality and wealth and power. Um, but I mean, the biblical, the God of the Hebrew Bible generally makes a connection between wealth and power and morality. That God in the prayers says that if you behave properly, you'll be rewarded with wealth and power, and if you behave poorly, you'll be punished with the destitute, lack of power, enslavement. And then you say, well, why is this person enslaved? God forbid, because he's a bad person. I mean, not to, bad is the wrong word, because he's an amoral person, or his parents were amoral. Like, God forbid, the curse of Ham type thing, where you say, well, if the person's in slavery, God is just. So the only explanation for their slavery has to be amoral behavior. And, like, well, a child is, so the sins of their ancestors. And even
Right.
Moses in
Right.
the Talmud, where, God says that to Moses, why did good things happen? And says, it's related to the sins and righteous deeds of people's ancestors. So from the atheistic perspective, you say that's just the falseness of religion, that there's absolutely no connection. I mean, you could argue a utilitarian view to some level of connection, but there's very little to no connection between morality and prosperity and power. But there is a science of prosperity and power, like like goods and economics, that if you follow the good business practices, you'll obtain wealth. If you follow the practices of power acquisitions, you'll gain power. And like Machiavellianism, it's got
Yeah.
absolutely nothing to do with morality. And then you have, like, well, it's about winning. Like Donald
Yeah.
Trumpism, or prosperity gospel, and to say, well, the goal is to win, and you did what it takes to win, and the winners write the history, and the winners are going to say that they were good and the losers were bad, and the reason they won was because they were moral, and the reason the losers lost because they were amoral. Or you could look for like weak, and some of the Nazi belief that had an amoralistic view where you had weakness and strength, and looked at morality as a form of weakness, and
Right, right.
in the sense that power is for the taking, and morality is a form of weakness that derives people of the ability to obtain power. Because if you're morality, you're saying, well, why can't you just take the power? You say, well, because it's wrong, because it's amoral. So, well, if that's what you think, you're never going to get it.
Right. So the relationship between good, being good, and goods. Yeah, that was a very good conversation that we had there. Um, it appears to me that if we look, how I look at it, between the individual and the community, or the individual and the group, um, that an individual as well as a society, or a family, or a nation, they prosper based on the rules that they choose or design to live by. So if there's if there's a flaw within your management system, within your codes and rituals and values and culture, so basically it's social engineering. So good social engineering allows for the society to prosper and survive. So therefore, a society or a person will only live as long, or relative to the quality of the engineering, the social engineering.
Well, like chess or something, you don't win or lose a chess based on whether you're, use the word good or bad person in terms like a moral, amoral. You win because you use good or bad strategy.
Yes,
And
that's
so
right.
like war and power, you could be an amoral person, but if you employ a good strategy, you're going to win. And you could be a moral person and employ bad strategy, you're going to lose. Just like business generally, uh, you prosper in business by making intelligent decisions, by partnering up with good business partners. And like a good business person is someone that does what they say they're going to do, and comes on time. Maybe is a man of honor in the sense they're man of their word. Like thievery or bad deeds might. There's plenty of utilitarian arguments that connect moral behavior and prosperity, but at the same time, there like the FTX fiasco, that one of the wealthiest people in the world appeared to have gotten that way by stealing and robbing, and like okay, he came down, and looks like it crashed and it's over, but he made it to the top through cheating people. And even like okay, like Hitler failed, the Nazis failed, uh, but people question how is power obtained, how is power maintained. And we talked about that in terms of like multiculturalism is zero sum. That if I'm promoting multiculturalism in the West and someone else is promoting nationalism, or ethnic nationalism, racial nationalism in the West, it's zero sum. There has to be a winner and a loser. Like you're not going to have a white Britain and a multicultural Britain. There has to be a winner, there has to be a loser. And morality is also group based, because in that sense, well, maybe what's good for you is bad for me, or what's good for my group is bad for another group. And like from the utilitarian perspective, like we talked in that Claire stream, you're going to say, well, the greater good, that okay, like is suffering absolute, where you want to minimize suffering in totality, and any suffering that's allowed bad, or is it just the least amount of suffering or the greater benefit? And if it one group has more benefit than the totality, like God forbid, like a system of slavery. Well, it was bad for the slaves, but it was good for the slave masters. And maybe in some utilitarian system, God forbid, you could say that the overall benefit to the slave masters uh, outweighed the suffering to the slaves in a an overall calculation from the world calculation. That like it sucks to be a slave, but overall on the world calculation, the benefit that the slave masters derived from the slaves outweighed the suffering that they had. And that could apply to war, murder, or any of these things, economic prosperity and group conflict. And that's why I said generally the Nazis had a conflict theory where conflict is the natural order. There is no utopian multicultural, we're all going to live happily ever after, like communist vision, where we're just going to be nice to each other and share. Conflict is natural. Someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. And, that's the reality of the world. And, if you don't get used to it, you're going to suffer.
So there seems to be two.
Just add on that to say that's somewhat like Israel. A lot of Israelis have made that calculation and determination that, like, God forbid, it's a kill or kill be rolled. Never again. You saw what happened to us World War II. So now we have chosen the path of strength. That to say, the good guys, the moral, or so say the good guys don't always win, and the bad guys, sometimes win. So I just want to win, because like I thought we were the good guys, but we lost. So now I just want to be on the winning team, and I don't care whether we're good or bad guys.
Right. Yeah, because good or bad is a matter of cultural perspective. If you believe there's such thing, there is any value in culture or identity value in itself. So yeah, so the concept of good or bad is related to intent, and as we were talking began at the beginning of the conversation, in the relationship between intent and identity. Intent and in identity, then those
intent and motive is the black box, because you never really know what what's inside the black box of intent and motive. But there's a relationship, presumably, between identity and intent and motive, and you could know what the identity is. And identity has multiple aspects to it.
Yes. So an identity itself is a vessel, a name, or an ID is an identity. So it's a vessel that stores entities. So for each identity is a separate entity. Each identity is a separate entity, and then each entity has its own view of what is right and wrong. So therefore the challenge then would be to create systems that enable efficient conflict resolution between separate entities, or in contrast, to set up an entity that is designed to destroy all identities, so that humanity is at one, and therefore if humanity is at one and there's only one identity, then therefore there's no need for conflict. So that view appears to be the moral high ground at the moment.
Yeah, well, an element, and that's in that it's utilitarian in general, and like so you could say the overall minimization of suffering, where it's good if suffering is limited, but and then there's the absolute approach to suffering, where it's not just utilitarian, the most benefit, the least amount of suffering, but you say suffering is absolutely bad in any case. That like the double ledger accounting, that benefit doesn't outweigh suffering. Suffering always has to be limited, and you can't weigh suffering versus benefit. And but said that there's a conflict theory of in group identity. So groups are in conflict. Like, so okay, I'm a Jewish American, or if you're a black Britainer, and those identities might be in conflict, where you're saying, well, what's more important of your identity, your blackness or your Britishness? And if there was conflict between the two parties, which one would you uh, decide? Or if acting upon your British identity causes suffering to the larger black identity, is it okay to take the benefit of, you know, selling out your own people for your own personal benefit based on these conflict in identity? So you have the question of group conflict, and so the modern concept. Then you have things like multiculturalism and say zero sum. They say, well, okay, well, maybe multiculturalism in the West, they currently think that that will cause the least amount of suffering and the most amount of benefit from a utilitarian perspective. However, from let's say the native European or white perspective, um, they're going to get a bad deal out of it.
Yeah.
That um, that factually, although the greater good will be for multiculturalism, for the native white person, that they're going to lose on the deal of multiculturalism. But say, well, how bad is their suffering going to be? And so if you're looking at it, well, like a trolley problem type philosophical issue, where, well, God forbid, we like there's going to be some suffering there, and that limits suffering. But I gave the case, God forbid, of what happens if you say, well, like the slave masters and the slaves, that you can say, well, overall suffering is uh, minimized and benefit is maximized by having slaves and slave masters, because although the slaves have significant amount of suffering, that the benefit the masters have outweighs the suffering of the slaves. And then you're going to put, well, that can't be right. But then what about multiculturalism versus nationalism, where you say, well, the
Right.
benefit of the minorities outweighs the loss of the ethnic majority? And to take, so generally, if we talked about like capitalism and economics and free markets are favoring the utilitarian approach. And then you have the rise of nationalism, like World War II, where you have conflict theory, where just there's going to be winners and losers, and there's going to be winning groups and losing groups. And the key thing that you could do as an individual is try to be on the winning side and try to see to it that your team wins. And that's the difference between American and Western Jews and Israeli Jews, where Israelis are nationalistic and Western Jews are anti-nationalistic. Because if you're Israeli, you think, okay, we're a group, and the key thing is our group wins. And from a utilitarian perspective, the benefit of our group winning outweighs the suffering of the other group. But as a minority in the West, that calculation will be the opposite. The benefit of the majority would be against us, so we support. So that's an intent motive. Like, why do Jews support nationalism in Israel and multiculturalism in the West? And so, well, because nationalism is in our best interest in Israel, and multiculturalism is in our best interest in the West. And so, it's basically utilitarian, is that people act in their own self-interest in a way to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And so you could say, well, the intent, the black box, we don't really know what's happening in the black box, but from the case of identity and superimposed calculation of utilitarianism of maximizing benefit and minimizing pain, we could theorize of what's going on inside the black box of motive and intent. And
Right.
that would
So
apply to blacks also. Saying, well,
yeah.
nationalism is more beneficial in Africa. The blacks presumably benefit more from nationalism in Africa and benefit more from multiculturalism in the West, so that blacks support nationalism in Africa and multiculturalism in the West.
Yes. So the fundamental maths or the engineering I see is that there's two ways of looking at it. Basically, people think that the concept of an identity allows for the concept of different identities allows for there to be conflict, whilst the destruction of identities, most people would say, well, that's for the greater good, because if you
So it's
destroy the
theoretical.
concept, I know, yeah,
I
that's
mean, you have to speculate whether that's even possible to destroy identity. And we say, like, you're no longer a black man. And say, like, well, yes, I am. Like, you're no longer
but
a
people
Jew.
work, yes, but then
You
people
say,
are
like,
working towards that.
I'm already
So the ideology
circumcised.
comes where people say, look, let's all be free. Let's get rid of borders. Let's get rid of countries. Let's get rid of nations. You see, so that's an aspiration. The aspiration is to destroy borders, destroy nations, because they're saying it's by having borders that there's reason for war. So therefore, the highest moral view, the popular view, is let's destroy countries, let's destroy borders, and allow for free movement of people around the planet. And that philosophy, that idea, should lead to a world of peace, because there's no borders. So that's the idea, that if there's no borders, then there's no identity, and if there's no nation, there's no identity, and then there's no property. And I think there's some famous quote saying, "You you will own nothing and you'll be happy." So that whole ideology is all in one realm: the destruction of identity, borders, property, and so on. And that seems to be the most popular view, or appears to have the moral high ground. And then in contrast to that, which is the camp that I'm in, I'm saying that I believe that all the concept of identity um, must be conserved, and that in itself will result in conflict between the various identities, the various nations. Yes, but I'm saying conflict is not war. Is just mismanaged uh, um, relationships between separate entities. So basically, good management of, or was it conflict resolution? That's it. So war and people being killed and all the bloodshed is basically the mismanagement of the relationship between separate entities. So that's the challenge, rather than
There may not be a solution to the challenge. There may just be, a problem without answers and more questions. The more you think about it, the more questions we have than answers. And then you get back to the question of high birth and low birth. What we would like to do is eliminate high birth and low birth, but which is another version of the question of evil. That factually, some people take high birth and low birth. Power is concentrated, and wealth is concentrated, and some people are born into it, and some people are born into disempowerment and poverty. And so you have a utopian view that doesn't correspond to reality, and trying to superimpose some non-realistic reality upon a theoretical reality is doomed to failure. And it could be we're you're damned if we do, damned if you don't. That there is no solution. That
yeah,
they
but
say, like,
the
unfortunately
will.
we're marching off to war, and there's nothing that could avoid it. Like, we'll have our duty, and society's declining, and war is the drums of war are beating, and we could have all of our lofty ideas and utopian visions, but God forbid, when the conflict gets nearer and nearer, that make our decisions, and you say, well, I would die with my view of morality rather than so. I mean, generally it's theoretical. So we're talking about practicality like business, governance, politics, foreign affairs. And so if we could agree on morality, like I would rather see no suffering and maximization of benefit. We could all agree upon that. Uh, in a saying we can't necessarily all agree on it because many philosophers and thinkers say that's impractical. That's
Yeah, it is
even goes
impractical.
against the natural order
Yeah,
of the way that God created the world, or the natural order
yeah.
of the
Because suffering
material
is a matter.
realm.
Suffering is a matter of cultural opinion, cultural perspective.
Well, I'm saying it's just saying you can't end suffering. You could theoretically say it'd be nice if you could end suffering, but that's never going to happen. That's like that's utopian, and it goes against the natural order of the human condition. And things like conflict or even peace. You're saying that you're saying like no, what we should be doing is preparing for war, and that's where you see largely most of the leaders. If it's Israel, even Biden, you think, okay, you get the Republicans or the Democrats, and they're both telling you we need to prepare for war. If you're in the U.S., both the Republicans and the Democrats are warning about dangers of increased tension with China, and the necessity of preparation for conflict with China. And say, well, it'd be nice if we didn't have conflict with China, but uh, in all the people in terms of power structure is telling, well, conflict is the reality, and we don't want to lose the conflict. You're saying it'd be nice
So
not
do
to
you
have the
accept?
conflict, and then, saying that's like, God forbid, the Israeli approach to never again, where like I'd prefer to not have conflict, but what I know about the world is conflict is the natural realm. So what I'm going to do is try my best to prepare to win for the inevitable conflict, and then you creating a self perpetuating cycle of conflict by preparing to win at conflict.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I got that.
so
I got that point.
like that first realm, I don't think that there's not really a movement of global altruism. You're saying like no, I mean almost all the forces are preparing for conflict, and you could put that in a material realm like wealth. The nature of wealth is to protect it. So the
That's right.
nature, if you're born into poverty, um, you want wealth, but if you're born into wealth, you want to protect that wealth. And even if you're born into poverty and you obtain wealth, you want to protect that wealth. So the natural inclination is of protection, and you're protecting against other people.
Okay, hold the
And
point there. Hold the point there because you're throwing lots of points in there. So this protection is directly related to the concept of identity. There has to be a you to own. Yeah, you have to have an identity. You have to be an entity to own something, to have property. So the whether it's a family, an individual, or a nation, in order to own property, it it has to exist. It has to be. It has to be. So there's others saying, well, they want to destroy borders, destroy identity, and destroy the concept of property. And in destroying the concept of property, it will lead to world peace. And so that that black box which you're talking about, they're moving with intent into the black box, into that unknown. That's where it comes into the will, the intent, the will. So I'm moving into the unknown with the will, with the intent to destroy the concept of identity and property, or I'm moving into the unknown with the intent, with the will to conserve identity and the concept of property. So the will is the force that you move into that unknown uh, realm of the intent that you described.
well, I mean the difficulty of you're mixing philosophy and politics, because you could philosophically question the nature of reality and then grounded in what people are politically trying to do. And you say like, well, because of democracy, and so okay, there's the facts on the ground of reality. You say the haves and the have-nots, the top 1%, uh, have more than the bottom 50%, but it's a democracy, so the bottom 50% can control uh, the power structures through voting. And if it's like the Democratic Party, they collectively decide to take from the haves and give to the have-nots.
Okay, hold the point there. Hold the point there. You just stated that I was mixing
Politics and
philosophy
philosophy.
and politics. Politics and philosophy. Right. So you see politics and philosophy as two separate things. Yeah.
Well, they're interrelated, but I mean, you're questioning what's the nature of ownership and property, or theoretic versus practicality of how people deal with it. So practically, it's dealt with through politics, and politics moves on regardless of philosophical debates. So we can argue philosophy all day, but then government's going to create policy that may be somewhat based on philosophy, but you're saying we're living in the material realm, and it's the realm of action, and politics is more action than theory, and philosophy
Okay. Hold
is
it
more
there. Hold it
theory
there. Hold it
than
there. Hold
action.
it there. Okay. So politics is a product of the will and intent, correct?
Well, of action. The philosophy is theoretical and politics is action. So you could likely connect that to intent or motive, that people act according to their intent or motive as opposed to philosophizing. That there's no intent. Okay, like I might have intent or motive why I think one thing or another, but we could just philosophize. I could, maybe this idea is true, maybe that idea is true, and then we could say, well, does this idea benefit me or not, in a separate venue of whether it's true or not. In politics, is more action, is going to be more based on intent or motive. That so what, I think you're right. However, it doesn't appear to benefit me. So even though you're right, I'm going to go with what benefits me, and that's in terms of politics versus philosophy, the action versus theory. And you're probably right that politics is more the realm of intent and motive.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. So all policy uh, is are constructs that are a product of the will and intent. So therefore, as an individual, my intent will cause me to act in a certain way. And if I come together with a group of people, we talk together, and then as we're talking together, then we may our wills may come together, and so we have a collective will, and our collective will is a collective intent, and then this collective intent is then is then uh, put down on paper as as a strategy, as a policy, So the the policy is the physical or the written uh, will or intent of the group, because it was just a desire, it was just an intent, it was in the head, but then that intent, when it's shared and put down in paper, then it's a manifestation of the intent of that group of people. So
Yeah, and
then it
that's why it's
becomes
temporal
policy,
and
and then it
subject
becomes
to change.
politics. Pardon?
So I mean, philosophy is less temporal or subject to change, is where politics is temporal and subject to change.
Yeah, but yeah, but that whole point of change is that once the group of people have collectivized their intent and will and put it into the document, then the document is then is the construct, is the machine that then goes on, and that document, that policy is supposed to achieve certain practical results, as deliver goods or deliver certain changes. And depending on the quality of that policy, depending on the accuracy, on the quality of the social engineering of that policy, um, will depend on how the intent will be delivered in the real world, whether those goods will arrive on time, whether those changes, that place will be built.
Yeah, and you
So
could look
I'm
at politics, like the philosophy, and you leave the black box unknown, and say like questions of free will, and say, well, maybe free will exists, maybe it doesn't. Maybe people out of their own free will choose to act in their own self-interest, or free will doesn't exist and people beyond their own control act in their own self-interest. In groups, people like identity, out of your own free will you choose to act according to your identity. It's like, no, the identity is the causal factor, and free will is limited in the sense the cause of your action is your identity, not your free will decision. Some of the politics, say like identity politics, and doesn't have to be just like modern, Marxist like identity politics of economics or race or group, but saying like, well, give me the person's identity, and then we could determine what's in their best interest, and then determine how they're going to act. Because if you take it as a rule, people are going to act in their own self-interest, and that refer as a group. So as an individual, that comes into conflict to say, okay, I will individually act in my self-interest, but if my ability to act as an individual is limited by my group membership, then I will act as a group. And that, when it comes to politics, especially in a democratic system, or even politics in general, social affairs, that we're limited to acting in groups, because individual action is largely meaningless, and therefore, politics is, the study of group action, and the determinism of group action is group identity.
Yes, and group action and group identity is the focusing of the collective will to construct policies that benefit the group. So the group decides on, through discussion amongst themselves. They discuss philosophy, and that their discussion of philosophy, by continued discussion of philosophy and what's the best philosophy for the group, will help the group construct an ideology and effectively direct the collective will to construct and socially engineer policies for the greater benefit of the group.
Well,
You agree with
might
that?
use the word philosophy. It says that philosophies are true whether or not they're good or bad for you. And so it's like,
Yeah, I'm not saying good or bad. I'm not
takes
talking about good or bad.
account the benefit, but it's saying that the philosophy could be more idealistic, and it's saying that there's some form of absolute truth that overrides individual or group interest. And that gets back to questions of morality. So I mean, you could look, if you're using philosophy like a strategy, but you're saying like a philosophy for how the world works, and saying, well, the philosophy is either accurate or inaccurate, and it's not temporal. That a philosophy, it's like a scientific truth, like gravity theory. Gravity, it's not temporal. It presumably, if it's a truth, it was true from the beginning of time till the end of time, as opposed to a political strategy is temporal, and it may temporarily work and then no longer work. Just like group identity, what's in the best interest of the group changes over time.
Yes. Yeah. So basically, there's the universe out there, and the philosopher will be looking at the universe and will construct language describing his or her understanding of the universe. And based on that understanding of the universe, that philosopher will then, who is part of a group or as an individual, will then put that understanding into writing or words. And then as that, those words can then be given to shared amongst a group of people. And then if they share that philosopher's philosophy, then the collective will be manifested. And once the collective will is manifested based on that philosophy of that vision, then that collective will 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 construct policies or rituals and patterns and culture, and then do things in the real world based on that philosophy coming and being manifested in the real world, so that they can actually do things. So what should we do now? What shall we actually do? What act should we do? And also that philosophy, those who share in the collective will also become part of the construction of that identity, because your identity becomes part of the collective will. It's a product of the collective will. You think like us, therefore you're one of us, and then you will do what we are doing or intend to do. So that's how I'm connecting philosophy with politics. It's a direct link. In challenge to what you were saying is that I get the impression you're saying that I'm making a mistake by collecting philosophy and politics together. I'm saying philosophy, politics is a product of philosophy. There's no separate.
Yeah, I mean, necessarily imply you're making a mistake, but I mean, they are two different fields that are interrelated, and you interact back and forth with each other. But I mean, to some extent, from the Greek perspective, that you say politics is a derivative of philosophy, that philosophy is like an umbrella category that includes politics, although they interact with each other. And just like history, like, oh God, I was doing the stream on, my books of World War II and the Holocaust, which are history books. There's something that happened, 70 years ago, and it's an element of history. And history, to some extent, also is under the subfield of philosophy, because you could have,
Yeah,
like
that's right.
just the what happened, how did it happen, to a question of why did it happen,
Right,
or the meaning of what happened. And
right.
you could be neutral, say, well, I can't, well, history is not here to tell you why or the meaning. History is just going to tell you what and how. And so, like, the history tell, well, this is what happened, this is how it happened, and why it happened, or the meaning of what happened, is a philosophical question, not a historical question. And you could base your philosophical determination of why and the meaning on the history, and just like politics. So history is dependent upon questions of identity and politics. So you say, well, what happened? And you say, well, this group. And so, like, what's a group? A group is based on collective identity. So you say, well, there were Nazis and there were Jews. And
Yeah,
like, well,
and
what
their
do
shared
Nazis and Jews
philosophy.
mean?
That's right. And
And you say,
that
well,
group and its shared philosophy, shared will.
you can't
That's
even
right.
really define it. You could say, well, what about all the Jews who were Nazis? Or, what about the difficulty of uh, classifying and making borders on identity? Say, well, really, you can't do it, but you could look at the history and say, well, there were perceptions that these groups or identities existed. So you say, well, just they say, well, white doesn't exist, but white privilege and white power structures exist, even though uh, white itself doesn't exist. And there's plenty of examples of, people that shouldn't be white, but somehow are white and benefit from white power structure. You put local politics, because there were systems of governance and power that were put in place, and then there were people that were um, intended to be part of that identity. There were people that maybe were intended not to be part of that identity, but were able to gain the benefit of the privilege of that identity. And there was group conflict, even though you can't precisely define the borders of groups or who should be part of one group or the other. But history requires, politics requires people acting in groups. So
Correct.
so there's Republicans and there's Democrats, and you look at racial identities and voting patterns, or
Yeah.
economics, measurements of ownership, and various things of group identity. Um, so even the what and the how require philosophy. But when you get
Yes.
more into the
Correct.
question, like the black box of why and meaning, you're getting more and more deep into the black box, because that it's extremely difficult to give uh, a definitive answer on. I mean, it's substantially difficult, maybe impossible even, to give a definitive answer on what and how. But let alone the exponentially more difficult to say why and the meaning. Although to
And
some extent, you
I'm
said,
saying, hold it. I'm
people
saying
have
that the
an
black box. Hold
intuition.
it, hold it. You can't let us
Well, I
off.
just finished to say that people say, well, there is the why and the meaning, and to me, the why and the meaning is easier to understand than the what and the how. They're like,
Yeah,
well, this
okay, okay.
is
Watch
data
this, watch this. You get me confused now. I'm losing track. So this black box, I'm saying, is the source of power. It's the source of power for the group or the identity. The identity is the vessel that captures, that allows you to wield the power that comes from the power source, which is in that black box.
of
So the
identity.
philo-
So say the motive to say that, okay, the what and the how, what was the identity, and then how did the identity operate as a group, to the why, the motive of people to operate collectively under this identity.
Yeah, but the identity is a construct, just like the ship or the boat of Ra. It's like the ark. Identity is a construct. It's a construct to hold entities, to move power. They're constructs. They have to be built. They're built. And if there's any flaw in the construction, then the identity can't hold the power. It's just like the ark of the covenant. It's built to hold. It's the same thing as an identity. It's a construct, a vessel to wield, to hold something.
Yeah, so you need a philosophy of history. And if you're going to claim, like, well, history, you'd have to learn history because history repeats itself, or because you could learn lessons from history, and that's already a philosophy of history. That you could have a deterministic view that really you can't learn anything from history. That I mean, because there's deep philosophical implications, and it's in the question of the heart bomb, the conscious, the black box of motive or intent. That if you can't make a determination about motive or intent, what could you learn about history? That you say, well, it happened, it could happen again. If it happens again, it might happen in the same way like it happened previously.
Okay, hold that
Um,
point. Okay, hold that point there. So you saying can't make a determination of intent. I'm saying you can. And the way you do it is by studying the vessel that contained the intent. So you're correct in a way. The intent is in that invisible realm, the unknown realm. So the way you view into the unknown realm is by studying the infrastructures, the constructs. So you look at the vessel, the construct, and then it's not absolutely accurate, but it gives you some view of the intent
yeah,
based on the design of the construct.
yeah, and I would say you could have like multiple truth hypotheses, like a truth value, like a computer evaluation of a chess position or something. Like you don't know the intent, but you could theorize on the intent, and you could provide evidence that one intent is more likely than the other,
Yes, based on
and even
the
like group
prior
intent.
chess moves, based on the first chess move compared to the second. So you can start to see based on each uh, the history of the game so far. So as the game continues, that's like that movie. Actually, we're having this discussion. Remember that movie called Pi? That's a beautiful movie. Can you remember the movie?
Yeah, yeah, we talked about
Yeah,
it.
and the game Go. It's the same debate they were having over the game of Go, and he was saying, "Look, as the game progresses, you can start to see a pattern." That's the same discussion that we're having right now. We're same debate. They said there is a pattern. There is a pattern. The pattern reveals itself as the game continues. the further the game goes on, it's the more clear the pattern is.
Yeah, but there's still dispute. So it's like, what's the lesson of the Holocaust? It was, well, different people interpret it differently and derive different lessons, as opposed to, saying Israeli versus Western Jews derive many times different conclusions. And you could say, well, you could give an explanation to why people derive different conclusions. You say that it's not a science. Politics isn't a science in the way that.
I don't know about that. Oh, I'm saying
Well,
the lesson that can be deduced from the
because you need
Holocaust.
morality. I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about first, of there being a connection between morality and power structures, and in the connection between moral, amoral, and power and wealth. So
Hold it there. Hold it there. The lesson of the Holocaust is the importance of identity. If you're not clear on identity, it's a mess.
well, I mean, that's say the conflicting. They're saying the lesson of the Holocaust is the destruction of identity or the importance of identity. You could draw the exact opposite conclusion, that the Holocaust, the lesson is to take your identity seriously, or the lesson of the Holocaust is to neutralize and not take your identity seriously.
The lesson of the Holocaust, I'm saying, is to take your identity seriously.
Well, I mean, it's one lesson. I'm just saying that you can't scientifically prove it. You say there's a school of people, like maybe like the Zionists or ultra Orthodox Jews, or some element that would take that as a lesson, but there might be other people that derive the opposite lesson, and saying that you need to diffuse identity, and the lesson is that you shouldn't have identity, shouldn't be important, because the root of conflict, that it comes to the nature of conflict, that taking your identity seriously, does that limit or cause conflict? Does having strong group
Hold that point there.
identity
Hold that point there.
cause
Hold
or
that point
limit
there.
conflict?
Hold it. Okay, look. I'm saying that taking your identity seriously will result in conflict, but conflict is not the problem. It is the management of conflict, relationship management between entities. That's the challenge.
You're
Taking
saying
your identity
losing the
seriously.
problem. You're
Pardon?
saying, oh, the problem isn't conflict, the problem is losing conflict. Ever, saying philosophically, no, if you have conflict, you're going to have losers, and there's no real way to make sure that you're not going to be on the losing side.
No, conflict
So the best way
resolution.
to resolve, so you want to get rid of conflict, and if identity causes conflict, and then the more identity you have, the more you have people trying to win conflict, and when you have people trying to win conflict, you're going to have losers. So that's why you have, like the school that you said, like, is the opposition to you, that wants to
Okay.
get rid of identity in order to get rid of conflict.
Okay, but winning and losing is still, I'm saying, is a matter of cultural perspective. That's how you can come to agreements.
Well, I don't even mean it's a matter of culture perspective. I'm saying, like, the
Yes.
slaves, if like if the victim, probably, there's really no way for the victim or loser to be the winner. I mean, you could have theological, like, okay, I believe I'm going to go to heaven, or you behave morally, and the victor behaved amorally, so I'm the victor even though I'm the loser. But in some practical, because politics, it's about power and wealth are realities. So you either have power and wealth or you don't, and if you don't, you're the loser, and if you do, you're the winner, and that's somewhat objective.
Yeah, but like, unlike the game of chess, there's it's almost like an internal game going on. There's no end, so you can't actually say, right, I've won or I've lost. It's just a movement of borders, just like the movement of identity. Yeah, yeah. The only thing is life or death. That's the only absolute. But the
That's
win
why
or
I said
loss is still a matter of cultural perspective. When two people or two entities sit around a table to discuss, um, they can come to an agreement, or they can come to a deal.
yeah, that's why I was saying, like, when COVID-19 hit, I started studying Holocaust and World War II less because, like, I thought it was important, and seeing the type problems that humanity faced. That people give the example of the leading up to World War II, but as COVID-19 hit, it became more apparent to me that the problems we face are going to be substantially different than World War II. And although there's important lessons from World War II, that those lessons are not really going to give us answers for the problems we currently face. And you say, well, philosophy, general truths, understanding of identity, and politics will give us answers, and you have a better understanding of that through understanding history. But it's like saying history rhymes. It doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And certain truths that we might derive from philosophy, psychology, theory of history are valuable. And like I said, that we're not necessarily going to win, but I want to be a moral person, but I don't think I'm going to win because I want or necessarily if successful at being a moral person. I'm more likely to win because I've mastered the skills. Uh, say like understanding history, philosophy, psychology doesn't make you a moral person, but understanding philosophy, history, psychology might make you more likely to win. And then there's the
Yeah, but
independent,
this win
separate.
lose, I don't know. We'll have to get. Yeah, I'm going to go now, but it's really good. We have to continue this conversation. This win lose. I'm saying winning and losing is a matter of cultural perspective, a matter of
Um, I mean,
philosophy.
possibly, but I mean, he's saying that
Yeah.
is there cultures that think that wealth and power is bad? And he's saying that winning and losing, like, God forbid, like, I mean, I'm not sure. Like, but I would put, I mean, yeah, winning and losing is somewhat hard to define because you're gonna need some.
That's right. That's the point I'm making. That's correct. That's
But I'm
correct.
not sure that
It's
there might be some universals that like having a long life and large amounts of children. Are there universals? Are there cultures
yeah.
that
That's
are
the
there
discussion.
cultures that
That's the
think
discussion. Are there universals,
dying
and
young
what
and
are
in
they? Are
poverty
there
is a
universals,
form of
and what
winning?
are they? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we'll
Okay, yeah,
discuss
appreciate you
maybe
coming on. So we'll
later.
talk again. God bless.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that conversation. Excellent. Thank you
Yeah,
very
yeah.
much.
Thanks for joining. So thanks IC3, my friend from London, joining in. So I'd say a few final words and I'll log off because it was an interesting conversation that it's tough to know. Like I showed the books, and that's why I said like, what does it mean? Is there an expert on World War II or the Holocaust, or like a debate, like the debate of revisionist, or like was then what's the value of understanding history? I'm a Jew, so it's important to me to know, or my identity, or it's important for all of humanity to know how are we going to make decisions, how are we going to face the troubles that are facing man and society now, and the knowledge of history better prepares us for making these important decisions, and the nature of the difficulties that are facing humanity are much more different than what led into World War II, but there's certain timeless truth, so to say, like political systems, power structures are temporal. However, possibly systems like on Freemasonry or philosophical political truths, you would say are um, not temporal truths; they're permanent truths, and the systematic understanding of what happened World War II also applies to what's happening today. even though what those parties and groups and identities were temporal. What it means to be a Jew uh, is likely different. There's what it meant to be a Jew in the time of World War II is in many ways the same and in many ways different than today. Capitalism, power structures, there's similarities and difference. So important history is important. Um, Certainly, of all the historical subjects, World War II and the Holocaust is the subject I've studied the most. Like I have general history. I like history of science, Jewish history, but like generally, I'm not a history buff. And history, I study history within subjects. And like I have books actually. Like I mean, I've read quite a few books on the theories of history and the philosophy of history and even the history of history. I take the great teaching company, great courses, and saying like the history of history. I just read a book um, I finished a few weeks ago on the history of history, and like in the philosophy of history, and like I haven't studied like I took the great courses on like Herodotus and Thucydides, and I said like Jewish books generally are ahistorical because that what how we understand academically in a field of Western canonization of history, uh, Jewish history is ahistorical, but within Jewish history, there's an importance, saying books that are written by Jews for Jews, as opposed to academic books that are written, um, so to say, within the theory of history, the theory of philosophy, as opposed to an American perspective, a German perspective, a Jewish perspective. So from the Jew, the Holocaust is extremely important, and like most of the books I read were written by Jews for Jews, and I showed the books today that were more historical, written by scholars for scholars, or academic books. There's a few popular books, but were written by scholars that, in theory, meet the scholarly process of what we call the field of history, and the field of history is dependent, saying is morally neutral. That we're going to say that we're going to look what happened, how it happened, and we might interpret, like I showed the Yehuda Bauer books on the of Yad Vashem. We get more into the why and the lessons. Um, so I'm going to end the stream. If there's any questions, quick, you could do an at Duvid. I'm not sure next week. Like I organized quite a few of my books, so I could do like psychology, business, um, engineering, politics, like or like I might do the Gurdjieff books also. I only have a handful, but it's an interesting subject, and if that would be more a presentation on Gurdjieff and the fourth way philosophy. The Judaica books, probably wait on. I might also do Islamic books or Christian books because I have a shelf of Islamic books, so it's possible maybe next week I will do my Islamic books, just to keep myself regularly streaming each week, and I have a reasonably big collection. So try to keep it going. Anyone who has comments on it, this is a God forbid an important, a dark subject, and God forbid if the world's spiraling into war. And I mentioned like the Israeli versus the assimilationist approach to IC3. We're talking about identity, and the same thing largely applies for Africans, where if you're in the West in a minority, generally you're going to support multiculturalism, but like in Africa or Israel, we're going to support nationalism and the assumption that identity determines motive based on best interest. The motive is the best interest. Then you have morality, that I will be moral even if it's not in my best interest. And you could still put in like, well, it's in my best interest to be moral because I believe in God and God will reward or punish me based on my morality. Or even a view like, well, maybe there is no God who rewards and punishes me, but I would rather die an immoral person. God forbid, I would rather die a moral person, um, even if there's no reward for it. Like the famous quote of the Baal Shem Tov, or be like Pirkei Avos, be like the servant who serves the master not for the sake of reward. that I would like to be a moral person, even if there's no reward for being a moral person. But yet, obviously, Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith that necessitates the belief in reward for punishment, reward for righteousness, and punishment for wickedness. But history to be neutral of morality within history. And then you could have an interpretation of a moral system within the facts of history, but generally, um, from the academic perspective, history should be morally neutral. And so you have the system of one of the arguments that I argue against atheism is, are you really morally neutral? And the question of karma, and the question, is there really no reward for being righteous and no punishment for being wicked? God forbid that, especially when you talk about topics like war and the Holocaust, or utilitarian approach, where is it possible that the winners have more benefit than the suffering of the losers? And these very difficult philosophical questions that are at the heart of generally the motive to understand history. God forbid, okay, I'm a Jew, and because we lost World War II, I constantly study it because I don't want to lose World War III. Had we not lost World War II in that sense, I wouldn't have the fear of losing World War III, and hence the motive to constantly study and look at and try to understand how and what happened. And that's the black box of motivation. Like, I'm not really sure. I could speculate on my own motives. Other people could speculate on my motives. And like I said, Veronica Kuzniar, who might have is looking at alternative perspective, and who's the winners, who's the losers, or a moral question, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and you're saying, well, say, well, I'm on Team Jew, whether we're the good guys or the bad guys. It doesn't matter whether we're the good guys or the bad guys. It's my identity, and that's the side that I'm on. Opposite sides looking at it like that also, versus some sort of global morality, and God forbid the situation in Ukraine and Russia, American politics, civil war, Israel, the rise of the right wing and nationalism in Israel, where it appears what happened leading into World War II is parallel to the situation today, where we're preparing for conflict and people are breaking into various identities and getting ready to fight against people who have the opposing identity. And the type questions, what could have been done to stop World War II, as opposed to what could have been done to stop the Holocaust, God forbid, from the internal Jewish question to what could have been done to stop World War II in totality. And it's very difficult. And so that's why I showed my books. And I'll probably, I put the stack there. I still have like 25 books that I bought that I haven't read yet on the topic. So generally the books on my shelf are ones that I've read already, and a lot of these were years ago. Like, many of these books I read like over 10 years ago. So just having this stack of books that I haven't read versus the stack of books that I have read, what does that even mean? It's like, okay, like how well do I know the stuff that I read? Just because I read it doesn't mean I really know it, or shouldn't, should or shouldn't read again. So God bless. I appreciate everyone tuning in. Tune in next week, the same time, 4 p.m. For another tour of my library, and we'll see. It could be most likely my Islamic books will be for next week. So the questions, virtual asylum, like I can't answer for Israel. You could say motives and interests, and say, well, they're acting in their perceived best interest. So the reason they're doing what they're doing is because it's in their perceived best interest. Or an interpretation of like, well, they're right and they're on the moral side, and they're in so I'm not a moralizer, and it's tough to know, and that's why I'm proposing the multiple truth hypothesis. And so I'll probably keep on going another few weeks, and going over my books, helping organizing my library will hopefully help organize my own thoughts. For the eventual, I'll do my tour of my Judaica library, which is by far the biggest section, and I'm organizing my father's math books. I just got today I have huge stacks of like math and physics books. Time is short. So I'd like to read more and understand more about World War II and the Holocaust. But at the same time, like it's probably more important for me to apply my efforts towards math and science. So both, and so time is short. So God bless. Thanks for tuning in, Virtual Isle, DeWitt, everyone in the chat. It was hard to follow the chat. So if you did have something specific you wanted me to address, just make a comment in the video and I'll reply, or you could have joined my Discord. Yeah, Kenneth, thanks for tuning in. So you join my Discord or make a comment or reach out on Twitter, or try to be responsive. Or if you want to, join, talk, we talk offline, or if it makes sense or time willing, or, consider, joining for a discussion in the next stream. So God bless. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great week.